Wow. Hey, pura vida, mi gente. Much love and respect. Thanks for tuning in once again. Appreciate you guys taking the time to do that. Today, we're just going to continue reading a book we've been reading. Really good book if you've been following. This will be a long reading, guys, so hope you're ready. If you're not, make sure to watch it when you have time. And there's a lot of great info throughout all the pages, so make sure you don't miss this one. So let's get right into it. Again, shout out to everybody in the live chat. Shout out to everybody that came later to watch the video. Really appreciate you guys taking the time to do that again. Let's go ahead and get into the book. All right, so again, we're going to get into the book Ancient and Modern Britons, Volume 1 by David MacRitchie, introduction by William Preston. And we go all the way to page 198. We're in chapter 13 of this book, continuing where we left off before. And it says here, since we see that the people known to us, especially as Picts, the Picti of Claudian, were of a black complexion, all right? Black complexion. All right, very clear right in the beginning, just so you remember. It becomes a question whether their chief allies, the early Scots, were not of a kindred hue. So the early Scots most likely were too. The two nations are invariably linked together in all records of the Roman conquest, and their chief historian at the present day seems to regard them as a king in blood. He tells us also that the Pictish inhabitants of ancient Argyll were, by one writer, styled Scotti, Picti, Scotti, Scotti, Picti, or painted Scots, and that the occasion on which the Scots proper first make their appearance in history is when, in conjunction with the nation particularly styled Picts, they began a series of fierce incursions into Roman Britain in the year 360 AD, all right, according to their chronology, right? The districts of the main island, which the Moravian Scots selected as the scene of their depredations, consisted of part of the mountain regions of Wales on the coast opposite to Ireland, from whence they came, from Ireland. It is now known by most people that the early Scots had at first very little to do with that portion of our islands now distinguished by their name. That Scotia prior to the 10th century was Ireland, and Ireland alone, all right? That was Ireland. And one of those propositions which Mr. Skene maintains lie at the very threshold of Scottish history, all Chaldea, Ur, Airi, Ur. And Gildas, writing of the Scots 2 centuries after the date of their first recorded advent, characterizes them as the shameless Irish robbers. This expression of the British monk would appear to hit off their chief characteristics very fairly, and it is under this guise, as land pirates and water pirates, that the Scots proper, like their fellow robbers, the Picts, are visible everywhere in history and tradition. Their appellation, Scot, is believed by some to have been given to them by their civilized foes, and to be a contemptuous term signifying vagabond. Gildas, at any rate, has no respect for them, as the following quotation will show. The Romans being drawn home, there descend in great crowds from the little narrow bores of their karogis or carts, wherein they were brought over the Stytic Vale about the middle of summer, in a scorching hot season, a duskish swarm of vermin, or hideous crew of Scots and Picts, somewhat different in manners, but all alike thirsting after blood, who finding that their old confederates, the Romans, were marched home and refused to return any more, put on greater boldness than ever, and possessed themselves of all the north and the remote parts of the kingdom, to the very wall, as if they were the true native proprietors. These references of the South British monk suggest several things, not the least important being the impression conveyed by the last words of the preceding sentence. But almost like they're saying these early Scots and these early Picts were navigators that had gotten there from the sea, right? Could they have been coming from America? It is evident that the Gildas regarded himself as a descendant of a race that had dwelt in Britain, or at least its southern portion, long before the arrival of either Scot or Pict. It is true that this may mean nothing more than that, in his eyes, Ireland and North Britain were foreign countries, and the expression Transmarine nations, used by him and by the Venerable Betty in speaking of Picts and Scots, is indeed held to refer to their residence in Ireland and that part of Scotland lying to the north of the Forth and Clyde, which, being at that date almost separated from the larger and southern part of the islands, was nearly as transmarine as Ireland itself. But the words of Gildas may bear a wide significance. The latter portion of the sentence just quoted is translated thus by another writer: the Romans having left Britain, they, the Scots and Picts, eagerly land from their currows, skin boats, in which they passed over the Scythian valley. The carts of the first rendering is thus an obvious mistranslation, and the vehicles in which those scuits or vagabonds conveyed themselves were the well-known coracles, still seen in Wales and Ireland, and used until within recent times by the people of the Hebrides, to whom they were known as curachs. They were also used, or they were used also at the date of the first inroad of the Scots by the inhabitants of another country, that to a South Briton such as Gildas was transmarine. This was the Oestrymnic archipelago, which lay to the north of Spain, and of which it has been supposed the present Scilly Isles form a fragment. A Latin writer of the 4th century has left us this account of the shipbuilding powers of the islanders. They know not to fit with pine, their keels, nor with fir, as use is. They shape their boats, but strange to say, they fit their vessels with united skins, and often traverse the deep in a hide. So basically, these are seafaring nations, right? That they're saying the Scots and Picts were. They're saying coming from Ireland, but were they always in Ireland too? You know, remember the history and the presentations from before when we're talking about these people coming from so-called Egypt or the Holy Land, right? Scotia, Queen Scotia, and we're talking about, you know, also the lands of Sarah and Judah, the Danites, the Tuatha Danann, all right? So put all the previous research we've done into what we're reading, you know, also your own understanding as well. It is pretty clear that although allied to the open coracles still used in Wales and fashioned of the same materials, yet the skin boats in which those various piratical races ventured out to sea and performed voyages of several days' duration could not have been of the same eggshell formation, or they would have been swamped by the first chopping sea they encountered. Let it be remembered that by several lines of argument indicated to some extent in a previous chapter, scientific men have reached a conclusion that a race not unlike the modern Eskimo inhabited certain parts of Western and Northwestern Europe at about the dawn of the Christian era, and it will be seen that if those sea coracles were themselves not unlike the kayaks of the modern Eskimo, or even exactly like them, there would be nothing surprising in the fact that this was really the case, I shall point out subsequently. In the meantime, it is sufficient to be content with the assumption that the Eskimo kayak and the Scythian sea coracle were identical, grounded on the fact that no other shape of skin boat could live in a tempestuous sea. Thus, the Picts and Scots may have been transmarine nations in a very wide sense, since by many links they are connected with other Scythian, sons of Isaac, Scots, Saxons, nations more remote from southern Britain than they were. The Silures, a very swarthy people, and the Spaniards of their time were seen to be both Picts, and they, along with other indigenous British tribes indigenous inhabiting interior England, the early Britons, and a large part of modern Scotland, as well as the black and painted races of Ireland, were also shown to have possessed many common characteristics and to have closely resembled each other in several physical traits. And the Picts and Scots, especially so named, although each title appears to have been a general nickname and nothing else, may thus have been transmarine, not only because they dwelt on the further side of the Irish Sea and the Firth of Darkness, that save for the mountain range that skirts the eastern side of Loch Lomond, would have severed the bulk of Scotland from the largest section of the island. Not only because they were apparently the kindred of the more distant Picts of the Spanish peninsula and the islands of the Oestrim Nidis, but also because they themselves, the Picts of the British Islands, are traditionally said to have come originally from that part of Scythia, lying on the eastern side of the North Sea, the exact locality fixed upon by some being no other than the Chersones Timbrica, that promontory that is now called Jutland, out of which some centuries later issued the Black Danes, right? The Black Danes, or Cimbri. They are not the same all as the Cimmerians. So that's the hijack on that. So that the Picts proper and the Black Danes, being both Picts and both Moors, both Picts and both Moors, and both being black strangers or the Gauls in the sight of the white races of Britain, coming as they appear to have done from the same locality, present themselves as not improbably akin. So yeah, many of these people were related, and again, a lot of history we've gone over with the different migrations, different peoples that gone into these areas. All right, so make sure to catch up on the previous videos. But a lot of the times they also generalize and group people into the same culture. That people are actually with these people too, but they're not all the same people. They're just part of their culture. That's what I'm trying to say. Hope you understand. So far, however, we have only decided, with regard to the early Scots, that they were the associates of swarthy, again, swarthy, piratical, painted races of black Eskimo or Negrito Mongoloid strain, like Genghis Khan and the Black Huns, Tartars, the black, so-called black Tartars. All right, again, swarthy, piratical, painted races of black Eskimos. Yes, they were so-called black Eskimos, guys, or what you call Siberians, Negrito Mongoloid strain, without reaching the conclusion that the Scots themselves were of the same complexion. Not same nation, but complexion. But this seems to be distinctly pointed out by Gildas when he chronicles the arrival of a duskish swarm of vermin, or a hideous crew of Scots and Picts, somewhat different in manners, but all alike thirsting after blood. The, the indifferent translation, which I have quoted from, does not enable us to see those invaders as clearly as we might, but another version is more exact. The precise words used by the monkish chronicler are these: Petri Scotorum Pictorumque Greges, the black herds of Scots and Picts. There is no ambiguity in the words, right? The writer himself, it is almost certain a white man, a so called white man, that's what he thinks, was recording an event that had happened only 2 centuries before his time. He was in the position of a 20th century Briton describing the Battle of Plassey, or of a Bostonian of today picturing an attack of the Wyandots or the Narragansetts. Better than these, he had likely enough seen one or more members of the race he was describing, which either of these supposititious or supposititious historians might easily have failed to do. Therefore, when he speaks of the black herds of Scots and Picts, we have every right to believe that in so speaking of them, he depicted them truly. They weren't just making it up, is what he's saying. They knew what they were talking about when they're describing these ancient people as dark complexion, as Negro, so-called black. The 4th century Scots then being undistinguishable from the general black herd that made up the Scoto-Pictish army were themselves of the same complexion as the Picts proper. That is to say, they also were Maori or Moors or black folks, so-called black folks. All right, you guys, absorbing all this info. You got to understand this. This is from the 1880s. This author, he did his research. He actually met a lot of these so-called black Scots, black Irish, black English descendants when he was writing his books. But this is tantamount to saying that the Scots were gypsies. Now, it is important to remember that although there are traditions of gypsy invasions of Scotland, at a time when a gypsy was an armed foe and no mere vagabond, yet there is no historical record of such invasions. That is to say, the invading foes were not called gypsies, all right? Listen to this, it's deep, by the historians. But such invasions could not well have happened, and within the memory of the people, without there being some recorded notice of them. Unwritten history tells us that bands of wild Moravian gypsies came into Scotland from Ireland, and that the gypsies themselves assert the same thing. Almost all the Scottish gypsies, says Mr. Simpson, assert that their ancestors came by way of Ireland into Scotland. Written history tells us that the Scots, also wild marauders or marauders, shameless Irish robbers, says Gildas, came over from Ireland. And the very district that especially tells us of their fierce and turbulent nature is full of stories of the wild Scots of Galloway. It is true that the gypsies do not style themselves Scots, and true also that the gap between the 6th century robbers of Gildas and the 15th century gypsies of the MacLellan story is immense. But it is held by some writers as stated a page or two back that the title Scot was given in contempt by the enemies of this people, and that it signified scuit, a vagabond, while there is no proof that the 15th century witnessed the first advent of the gypsies in Scotland. Farther, the wild black Irishman, all right, black Irishman of Queen Elizabeth's reign, with his plaited hair, all right, his plaited hair, his swarthy skin, plaited, braided, right, and his Fenland hunt was virtually a gypsy. Or from Egypt. Remember what gypsy means? From Egypt. And his island was the mother country of the Scots. And when we're talking about Egypt, we're talking about the real ancient Egypt in America. The speech of the Scots of Galloway was the Sedimo Pictorum. The Moors were Picts. The Gypsies, whether as Moors or as Gypsies, all right, were picked by all these names. Substantially the same people are intended, all right? You understand? The Scots were Gypsies. However, contradictory this deduction may appear, it must never be forgotten that the people who made Scotland an independent nation were not Scots. The Bruces, the Wallaces, the Stuarts, and many other lesser names were Normans and Flemings, all right? That's a big one. A lot of people think that the Stuarts, King James and his family were indigenous to Scotland or the highlands of Scotland, and they're not. They came in with the Norman invasions. Yeah, Swarthy, remember? Schwartz. It is true they identified themselves with the earlier races and readily assumed the name and some of the ideas of their adopted country. For men are very chameleons in their aptitude for taking on local color. But they were not Scots. The rank and file of their followers may have been Scottish. Some of the leaders were so. For example, the good Sir James, the most loyal of the Bruce's knighthood. But he came out of a race that boosted his ancient aboriginal blood and that bore a surname which signified the black man. All right, we're going to learn what that means. And he himself, although by his time, the family of Douglas, that's what he means. Douglas is two different ways of saying black, black. Dope, dope, and gloss is two different words for black, black. Has likely enough made more than one alliance with the whites. He himself was of a black, all right, of a black and swart complexion, according to Godscroft, for which cause he was known to his foes as the Black Douglas. Thus, although his high birth and all the chivalrous qualities attributed to him by Barber rendered him a splendid specimen of a brave and courteous gentleman, and although he died in battle with the Saracens of Spain, he was actually in some degree a Moor or Saracen himself. So look what they're telling you. He was in a war against the so-called Moors. So, they're calling him a Moor. So why would he be fighting a Moor? This is what I'm trying to tell you guys. Everybody in Europe is not really a Moor only because they are so-called black or Swarthy, even though that gets applied to them because the word eventually was began to use as complexion, but it wasn't always. It was a specific people at first. Wasn't every dark complexion European always. All right, here we have an example of him, a Swarthy guy from Scotland, an Aboriginal. They're saying, right? He's indigenous to that area. He was fighting against the Moors or the Saracens of Spain, and farther this Moorish blood. See that now they want to say, because the authors they're also going with out of Africa. Like this dark skin has to be Moorish or coming out of North Africa. But this Moorish blood must have run, must have, in the veins of the chiefs of his house for fully a century after his death. For the Black Douglases, or those of Liddesdale, retained the headship of their clan until the year 1455, when they were overthrown and their estates forfeited in favor of the younger and rival branch of Angus. See what happened to the Black Douglases? You see how they got defranchised? And it became saying in allusion to the complexion of the two races that the Red Douglas had put down the black. You see that? The red took over the black. Crayon colors. But although the Douglases and other tribes belonged to a race that, by one name or another, preceded the Normans, yet the prime movers in the struggle that ended in Scottish independence were not Scots. The two great heroic figures of that era were not Scots, neither was the first of the royal Stuart race. At Bannockburn, Norman fought Norman, and Fleming, Fleming. And when the Bruces had reached the summit of their power, and Edward Bruce made the haughty discovery that Scotland was too little for his brother, and him also, his chief generals in the Irish campaign were kindred Normans, such as Sir Philip Mowbray and Sir John Stewart, or others of the race of Sir Neil de Fleming. Of course, it is not to be understood that these two were the only so-called white races, you see, because they're coming from Normandy. They're supposed to be white at that time in the country, or that they constituted the greater portion of the two armies of Bannockburn. Centuries before this period, Britain was known to be inhabited by swarthy Moors, or people of dark complexion. This is what I'm saying. They are just linking the word Moor with dark complexion here. Whether these were found among the Cornish, the Moni, and their Scottish kindred of the Forth Marshes, or elsewhere in the British Islands, and coupled with them were the fair-haired Keltoy, and men of the stamp of the white-skinned barbarian prisoner. Were these really white-skinned people? When they're saying fair hair, does that mean they were pale-skinned? These again had been reinforced from time to time by inroads of black heathen and white heathen, more or less akin to either party, and the mingled nations and fought and intermarried, had formed leagues of amity and broken them during all the 1400 years that stretched from Caesar's landing to the achievement of Scottish independence. All right. So definitely there was light-skinned people, guys, and I'm definitely don't disagree with that. I'm just saying the generalizations is we got what we got to be careful with, and consequently, our predecessors of the 14th century must have belonged to many variant types whose differences were at that time sharply defined in those of unmixed blood and blended in every possible permutation in the hybrid population that must have inevitably arisen, so that at the Battle of Bannockburn, the combatants on either side must have belonged to many races, whether they fought it in the ranks of the so called English army or of the so called Scottish. That in the latter army there were many pure Scots cannot be doubted, the most distinguished of these being the swarthy Douglas Knight. All right? But historical records tell that their leaders belonged to other races, and these races must have been largely represented in the ranks also. All right? So they try, you got to dodge the hijack because they try to say, no, they belong to other. They weren't so called black or swarthy. Professor Skeet draws attention to the fact that Dutch or Flemish mercenary soldiers helped to fight the battles of the Normans and that these Flemings settled in great numbers in various parts of England, while a glance at certain Scottish pedigrees reveals that in North Britain also the Flemish invaders appear as the allies of the Normans, with whom they shared the fruits of conquest, land, and power. In Mr. Skeen's sketches of Galloway, during the century prior to Bannockburn, he indicates a similar movement there. The Scots of Galloway, like the Moors of Morayshire, are seen rising up in rebellion against Norman barons, the vassals of a partly Norman king, and whether in the north or in the south, the rebellion is crushed, and great numbers of the rebels slain. The country now called Scotland had not yet attained a national existence, but in its most important parts, a new power was making itself felt, and the Normans and the Dutch were among the chief ingredients of this power. The Battle of Bannockburn, then, was not won by Scots proper alone, but by a greatly mixed multitude. A mixed multitude, Abyssinian, a mixed multitude, Abyssinian, of which they formed a part. Many of the leaders were, no doubt, Scots, although the more distinguished were chiefly non Scottish, and none among them, of whatever race, excelled that famous Scot, the Black Douglas. That famous Scot, the Black Douglas. It would be difficult to find a better example of the Scot proper, and accordingly it is worthwhile to look at him and his lineage a little more closely. He belonged to the oldest sept of his clan, that known as the Black Douglases, a term which proves to the ontological when analyzed, since dub glass, all right, this is what I was saying earlier, dub and glass signifies the black swarthy man, okay? Douglas, that's what it means. Literally, anybody that goes back to black folks. That name, if you're a Douglas, it goes back. You might have so called black ancestors, swarthy ancestors, Negro ancestors, and it's okay. Embrace that. Their origin is shadowy, but one tradition states that the first of the family distinguished himself by his bravery in a battle against Donald the White, a Norseman of the 8th century. From this half mythical figure down to good Sir James, who fought at Bannockburn, there is a fall of nearly 600 years, time enough for any amount of changes in the race. Indeed, there is a hint that such took place, and a suggested alliance with the Flemish Breskin of Moray during the 12th century. However, this may be it is evident that Sir James Douglas inherited the blood of his swarthy ancestors. All right? whether he was a lineal descendant of the 8th century Douglas or the, the black Swarthy men. Quite likely, he was not, but only a scion of the same tree. Barber has enough to say of him from the days of his youthful throatlessness in Paris down to his gallant death in Spain. But it is only with Barber's description of his complexion that we have to do here. And this, he says, was Stumdale gray, his hair being black. As already stated, Godscroft remarks that he is said to have been of a black and swart complexion, an expression somewhat stronger than that used by Barber. This dusky skin earned for him, says the historians, the title of the Black Douglas. And although the good Sir James to his friends, he was such a terror to his foes that their most troublesome children could at once be hushed into good behavior by a single threat of a visitation from that dreaded bugbear, the Black Douglas. So say the run of historical writers. But without throwing any doubt upon the complexion of the good Sir James, it may be well questioned whether this title was his peculiar property. There is indeed every reason to believe that it served no more to distinguish him from other black Douglases than the black man would separate one out of a whole tribe of black men. Exactly. That's what I'm trying to tell you all the time, guys. Doesn't mean he's the only. We see this by looking at the chiefs of his clan without even taking their followers into consideration. For not only was the good Sir James known as the Black Douglas, but so also was his grandson, all right? A son of Archibald the Grim. So apparently was the 8th Earl of this line, who was killed at Stirling in the year 1452. All these people are Swarthy. You know, this guy was killed, it says here, by King James II. More than this, it seems very probable that Archibald the Grim, who has just been referred to, was really so called because he was Archibald the Black. This is actually stated by one writer who says that on account of his swarthy complexion, all right, this historical European person was also a black man, guys. Because this is right, this is the primary source he's quoting and describing this guy, right? Barber says, on his account, his swarthy complexion, he was commonly called the Grim, which statement brings to light an obsolete meaning of this adjective, a meaning which must only recently have passed out of use. All right, that's why he was called the Grim, because he was so-called swarthy or black. Accordingly, we have 3 successive chiefs of this clan, and another in the following century, all styled the Black Douglas. Or what is equal to that, on account of their swarthy complexion. All right, I hope this is ingrained in your mind now, and you know this, not just believe, but you know these people were so-called black. These were what you call melanated folks, so-called Negro people, you know, whatever you want to say, however you want to say. But that's the point. This ain't debatable. There is thus no room for doubting that the chiefs of the Black Douglas tribes were styled the Black Douglas because of their dusky skins. It wasn't just one person, it was all of them, and not from any accidental circumstance, such as that which, it is said, gave rise to the epithet attached to the young hero of Cressy. Not no make-believe stories. Oh, it means black because, you know, he lived near this black swamp, and then, you know, sometimes his eyes would get black, and his hair was black, you know. No, not because any of those made-up stories, guys. They were literally swarthy people. Wherever you encounter the Black Douglas in history or tradition, you find that he is a black man. All right? He is a black man, and he still is a so-called black man. All right, you guys hear that? The following example is one out of many, and whether the romance in which it occurs be wholly fictitious or almost wholly true, the expressions used denote the prevalent inherited opinions regarding the complexion of the Black Douglas. By your father's crown, cried Ragamuffin, I see nothing for it but to obey. The difficulty lies in the selection, for If I am able to appreciate the beauty of women, thou will have to choose between a crow and a rook. Elizabeth of Dunbar is the descendant of Black Agnes, who defended that old castle in the days of the second David against the arms of the Duke of Salisbury, and Elizabeth of Douglas cannot fail to have her some portion of the blood of the Black Earl, who fell in Spain trusting to the protecting charm of Robert's heart, which he carried with him in a casket. So thou seest the black choice thou hast got. All right? This is quotes, primary sources here, guys. It is plain then that several, at least, of the chiefs of the Black Douglas clan were themselves black skinned men. All right? No debating this. They could not well have continued to be so for very long after the period at which they begin to appear in history as veritable flesh and blood, as distinguished from the fictitious creations of medieval genealogists, because their first authentic appearances coincide with the time when the barrier between black and white have been broken down in many places and the two opposite types had greatly intermingled. This movement is seen in their own history, which tells of intercourse, political and matrimonial, between them and such white races as the Normans and the Flemings. All right, dodge the hijack. You see what I'm saying? This author is making generalizing that all the Normans and Flemings are so-called the white ones. When he's saying, when he's actually teaching us about the so-called Black Danes. But yeah, we know that in the region of Normandy, Flemish area, there was many melanated people there as well since ancient times. Eventually, this tendency resulted in the disappearance of the pure Black Douglases from place and power, the last of them being James, the ninth Earl, whose tribal scepter was thenceforth swayed by the chief of the half-blood offshoot known as the Red Douglases. All right. So this is almost like, oh, this was the last Maya, and this was the last Narragansett. This was the last Atacapa Indian, because they look different. No, no, they were just reclassified. That's literally what really happened. Everybody got turned into Africans in Europe too. Yeah, come on, tell it how it is, really. That's what really happened, guys. This last chief of the Black division of the Douglases, the main stem of the Douglas tree, was James, ninth Earl. He had succeeded his elder brother in 1452, and his first act after assuming the chiefship was to take up arms against his king, James II, in order to avenge the death of his brother and the sixth Earl, both slain by the king or his partisans. Or rather, his direct aim was to settle once for all whether Scotland should be ruled by Norman Stuarts or by Moorish Douglases. Listen to this. So he's trying to make the Stuarts white. He's literally trying to make King James and them white, and that the local people, right, the Picts and the Douglases were the so-called Moors. But this is his terminology in his time, and this is how he explains it. Of course, the Norman and we know the Stuarts weren't just white or pale-skinned people, all right? But it does tell us of a history here, that most people don't really understand. The Stuarts were coming in, as in, they came in. They weren't indigenous to that area. So a lot of people were fighting for that power between the local uh, Swarthy people that were already there or the new Norman Stuarts, right? A question which this proud and powerful caste has practically been putting for several generations. The struggle ended in his utter discomfiture and the complete downfall of his race, their estates passing wholly away from them and being soon after bestowed upon their distant kindred, the Red or Angus Douglases, who had insisted in bringing about the ruin of the ancient stock. The Red Douglas had put down the Black. All right, again, the Stuarts were not pale skinned. These are Swarthy people on Swarthy people, right? The Swarthy history here. The eighth lord of this terrible family is thus oddly sketched by MacTaggart and his Galloway book, Black Douglas, perhaps the greatest villain ever known in Galloway. His den was the castle of Strave, a befitting keep for the tiger. He kept the country round him in awe for many a day, Even the Scotch kings could make nothing of him. He caused Lord Kirkcudbright MacLellan to be hanged by a rope from a projecting stone in his castle wall, yet to be seen, and took his dinner calmly while his hangmen were doing so. Some say he was dirked in Annandale, but how he came by his death is uncertain. However, he did not die a natural death. From whatever source MacTaggart obtained these statements, they are not in accordance with those made in history, and are evidently only half truths. For this is the Earl who was stabbed by King James at Stirling in 1452, and that MacLellan, whom he hanged from his castle wall, was no Lord Kirkcudbright, the title being a subsequent creation of Charles I. Remember, a swarthy man, we got the video already in the sources, but the tutor or guardian of the young Laird of Bombay, or Bombay, of whom we have heard, and who was ancestor of the Lords Kirkcudbright. The story of Douglas's treachery toward MacLellan and his own subsequent death, as related in the tales of a grandfather, thus reconciles the local tradition with recorded history, though in a partial degree only. 2 years after the death of this cruel earl, his brother, the last lord, was confronting the army of King James in the open field. The king's army had laid siege to one of the Douglas castles, that of Abercorn, and Douglas himself had marched an army of 40,000 men to raise the siege, when suddenly he found himself one morning deserted by all his vassal lords and their forces, who by dissension and jealousy, or by the diplomacy of the royal party, had gone over in a body to the king. He then appears to have fled southward into Annandale, where he lurked until the following spring, 1455. In the meantime, his brothers, the Earls of Moray and of Ormond, had headed the other sections of the Black Douglas Confederacy and offered a determined resistance to the king, but their army was completely crushed in the May of 1455, themselves slain, the Douglas castle besieged and reduced, and finally the Douglas estate forfeited, and the main body of the race overthrown forever. Right, you guys hear that? The Black Douglas himself escaped into England, out of which he made one or two raids into his old dominions, but he never achieved anything, and finally died a prisoner in the Abbey of Lindores in the year 1488. Thus, the legendary version of the Galloway peasants is incorrect in many particulars, though preserving faithfully the feeling with which this haughty despot was regarded by a certain section of his subjects. At the time when the Black Douglas was hiding in the recesses of Annandale, the royal forces were everywhere attacking the Douglas strongholds and altogether stamping out the Douglas power. King James in person is said to have headed that division, of his army that besieged Threave Castle, the den referred to by MacTaggart, and the scene of the base murder of MacLellan. 3 years previously, there is a local tradition to the effect that when the king arrived in the neighborhood, he was presented by the MacLellans with a heavy piece of ordnance, sometimes confounded with the Mons Meg at Edinburgh Castle, with which to batter down the walls of the Douglas Castle, the home of their hereditary foe. And it is evident that at this particular junction, the hatred which the Black Douglas had inspired in the MacLellans must have been deep. Only 3 years before, his brother had treacherously killed the temporary head of their family, the young Laird's guardian, and this for no other reason than that he had refused to join the Black Douglas Confederacy in the attempt against the Stuart power. All right, you didn't help me go against the Stuarts, man. In return for this foul action, the MacLellans had invaded the Douglas territory with fire and sword, but for the time being with evil results to themselves. For it is stated in their history that as punishment for so doing, their office of Sheriff of Galloway, so long held by them, and also their family estate of Bombay, became forfeited. to the crown. Now, this is a curious statement. For being overzealous vassals of the crown deprived them of their rights. All right, you guys hear that? And it is equally remarkable that King James had been roused into indignation by this very act of the 8th Lord Douglas, indicating, as it did, the extent of the league that had been formed against his sovereignty, and also an insolent indifference to the king's opinion. Stung by this culminating action, into making a decisive movement, he had, by means of craft and unworthy dealing, inveigled the 8th Douglas to Stirling Castle, where he killed him with his own hand. This happened immediately after the murder of MacClellan. Now it is very unlikely that at such a crisis the king would deprive a loyal family of their possessions, and that for an excusable act of revenge against a rebel, nor is it likely that he would do so to conciliate the new Lord Douglas, the brother of the traitor. For this other Douglas was as fierce a rebel as his brother, and his very first act, it is stated, was to take up arms against the king. The likeliest solution of the question is that the Bombay estate and the sheriffship of Galloway had been wrested from the MacClellans by the Douglases. Immediately after the murder of MacClellan and the ensuing raid made by that clan into the Douglas country, the crown to which these honors were forfeited was not the normal one, that of the Norman Stuarts, but the real one, real so far as Galloway was concerned, that of the Scottish Douglases, then on the eve of revolt, of whatever stock the MacClellans were. And in speaking of the Ross-shire MacClellan mixture, it was suggested that they were no other than the Norman Fitzgeralds. They had been faithful adherents of the Stuarts, so that when King James had destroyed the castle of Threave, in doing which he was assisted by the MacClellan artillery, and after he had overthrown the Black Douglas League, it would have been only natural consequence of these events had he restored the Bombay lands to their rightful owners. He did so. He did do so, but the exact date seems unobtainable. It must have been prior to 1460, the year of his death, and it cannot have been before May 1455, the date of the great Douglas defeat. The most natural time and place for this act of restitution would be when he was personally present in the neighborhood of Bombay, elated with his complete success in the recent struggle for the throne, in which he had all along been aided by the loyal MacClellans. But the family tradition does not say that this was the case. It tells us that the estates were recovered at this very time, 1455 to 1460. But it states that they were given as a reward for the death of a Moorish or Gypsy chief. That's, the narrations, the false narrations they added, who had been terrorizing the Galloway district, and for whose person, dead or alive, the king offered a reward, the barony of Bombay. This, the young chief of the MacClellans himself, succeeded in obtaining, slaying the gypsy, and bringing his head to the king on the point of his sword, in commemoration of which incident he thereafter bore as his crest a Moor's head on the point of dagger with the motto, "Think on." All right, so remember, this is that main story where they always say, oh, no, it's not because they were Swarthy. They're not depicting themselves on these families because they're depicting the Moor's head, after we took over their castle, invaded, cut off his head. See, this is a generalized story, guys. So dodge the hijack. They were all Moors. You're saying the MacClellans weren't Swarthy? See, that's what you don't understand. Dodge the hijacks. So then Galloway was devastated in the year 1455 by two separate black-skinned races. You see? The one, the historical race of the Black Douglases. The other, a traditionary company of Moors, Saracens, or Gypsies. You see? They're all melanated people. It's not about somebody cut off a black man's head and put it there as a trophy on their crest. Come on now. Why would they put an enemy's head on your family crest? Come on, man. Both were the enemies of King James II. Both were enemies of the MacClellans. So important were the robbers in the eyes of the king that he issued a royal proclamation and held out a spacious barony, as a reward for their destruction. The hero who slew the robber chief was the deposed heir of Bombi, and in killing him he regained the lands of his forefathers. He had not received any token whatever of kingly gratitude for the unswerving loyalty of his race during the perilous days of the Douglas ascendancy. He was not rewarded in any way for the aid which he and his clan had rendered the king in this final assault upon the fastness of the arch rebel. For the slaying of a wretched bandit, he had been restored to all honors that were his birthright. In return for the loyalty that had cost him these honors, he received nothing. Is this credible? All right. Now listen, like that's the he's questioning these stories. Were there two different races of Moors existing in Galloway at this time? You see why he's so confused? Could there be two different it was all melanated people there, guys. There was many different types of melanated people. Yes. Could they be there at the same time? Both so hateful to the Stuart king, but only one of them recorded in history? Or are these not two different versions of the same story? It is hardly reasonable to believe otherwise. John McClellan's motto of think on means nothing if it does not bear reference to the cowardly slaughter of his guardian 3 years before, with the consequent ruin brought upon his family and a fixed resolve on his part that wrong should be right one day, even had such a hypothetical rival confederacy of Moors attempted to ravage Galloway on their own account. The absolute power of the Black Douglas would have crushed them at once. Or on the other hand, if they could have existed in spite of the Douglases, would they have been foes of the Stuarts as well as of the Douglases at a time when the whole district belonged to one side or the other? But the notion is unattainable. The Douglases themselves were a gang of black, marauding Moors or Gypsies, all right? All these tags, they were swarthy people, melanated people, basically, certainly on an extensive scale. So extensive indeed that the injured king might well put a heavy price upon the head of their leader, dead or alive, all right? So they were marauding, they were pirating, they were doing a lot of things that, so that's why they were on the hit list. That's basically what he's saying. Who this leader was is not quite certain. He could not have been the nominal head of the clan, for he was not one of the actors in the closing scene, having then or soon after made his escape into England. Besides, his end was, after all, a peaceful one, and he did not die until 34 years after MacClellan's sword had severed the gypsy's head in Galloway. And in this there is certain fitness, because although the titular head of the Black Douglas sept, this last earl had inherited some share of the so-called white Norman blood, and consequently a Moor's head crest would not have been a wholly appropriate emblem had his been the head that MacClellan brought to the king. You see what I'm trying to tell you guys? He's saying it. Why would they put, if he's so-called white, why would they put a Moor's crest on the crest, right? The leaders of the Black Douglases, when finally brought to bay, were the chief brothers, the Earls of Moray and of Ormond. Thus, the gypsy or Moor of the MacClellan story was in all probability one of these. They're just talking about the Douglases. It may be that he was the Earl of Moray who was killed at the crushing defeat of Arkingholm or Langholm, Dirk and Annandale, as the local tradition has it. But it is much more likely that he was the third brother, Hugh, Earl of Ormond, who is not said to have been slain on the field of battle, as was Moray, but to have been taken prisoner and afterwards beheaded. The fact that the aristocracy of this race were great nobles, possessed of lands and dignities in France as well as in their own country, the leading figures in Scotland for several generations and almost the occupants of its throne, this fact is in no way affects the ethnological deduction just arrived at. The eye of the peasant sees only the most apparent characteristics of the local overlord. The peasant, understanding, knows nothing of his historical attitude. This may be seen in 1,000 instances. Therefore, to a certain section of the peasantry of Galloway, presumably those of Norman Flemish, and Celtic blood, the Black Douglas was simply a swarthy tyrant like the Black Oppressor of Welsh tradition or that other Black Knight recorded by Galloway, whose sway extended over various districts of Lancashire, where he held the people in vassalage and used them with great severity. And in the diction of the past, a black man was a Moor, so that when the Black Douglas and his brothers, with others of their tribe, had retreated to the winds of Annandale after the defection of their allies in the year 1455, they were virtually a band of marauding gypsies or Moors. That's what they had become because they had gone overthrown. So that's what they started doing. As the legend of the MacLeans testifies, they had been utterly discomfited. Their power and position in the country was gone forever. Another had taken their bishopric. From that time forward, they were outlaws outside the law and rebels cut up into separate bands and lurking in mountains, fastnesses, and the intricacies of the border Moses as a political power in the country or as nobles under a semi-Norman monarchy. Their days had come to an end, and precisely at this point of time, when the last vestige of Pictish or Moorish or Blackish power had crumbled away, and the latest representatives of Moorish nobility had sunk into the position of hunted bandits and outlaws. The gypsies of Galloway make their appearance. All right. Again, guys, when they say Moorish, don't think Moorish signs, Moabite, North African Muslim Moors. Don't think like that's. He just means Swarthy folks. From that date onward, a Black Douglas was equivalent for a gypsy. So after the Douglases were defranchised, dethroned by the MacLeans and the Stuarts, right? They became like peasant people. They had nowhere to go. They were on the move. They were like, started robbing people, marauding people, like pirates, like almost Indians that get, thrown out into the forest after they get invaded by Europeans, right? So after that is when they began to be called gypsy, right? This is seen in another way. Claudian's lines have revealed to us that the historical Picts of Britain were ethnologically Maori, being Picty only by custom. Therefore, the Picts of Galloway were the Moors of Galloway. Now, in detailing the chief ingredients of the army of King David of Scotland, timelines, false chronologies, this is what I'm trying to tell you. At the Battle of Standard, Mr. Skene makes this statement. The first body of his army was composed of Galwenses, or people of Galloway, who still bore the name of Picts, and who claimed to lead the van as their right. 4 or 5 centuries after this, in 1593, at the Battle of Glenlivet, the Earl of Angus, head of the Ruat or Tawny Douglases, that younger and half-blood branch to whom in 1455 had come all the hereditary Douglas honors, claimed the leading of the vanguard, alleging that this honor of right belonged to him, being the ancient privilege of the Douglases. Whether therefore we view them as 12th century Moors or Galloway, or as 16th century representatives of the Douglases or black men of Galloway, same thing, guys. This is black folks, what they talking about. We see distinctly the same stock. As historical Moors, they are Picts, or painted men, tattooed men who are Swarthy. As historical Douglases, they prove the correctness of their family name by claiming the right of the historical Moors of Galloway as their own ancient privilege. Therefore, either as Moors or as Douglases, synonymous terms, it just means Swarthy people, they are Picts or painted men. As traditional Moors, they are gypsies, and thus under showing of gross, the antiquary, and by the ruddled skins of Gypsy Marshall and his gang, the traditional Moors of Galloway are painted men. The Gypsy King Marshall that he met, guys, this author met. He knew he was Swarthy. He saw him. Moors, Picts, Gypsies, Falls, all were Douglases of Galloway. Even the Falls, right, the last king of the Gypsies, They were all subclasses of swarthy men, black men, so-called black. The Black Douglases were taken as examples of the Scot proper, or early Scot, but this we have seen as equivalent to Moor or early Pict. The black herds of Scots and Picts were all alike to British gildas. The Picts of ancient Argyll were Scotti, Picti, painted Scots, shameless Irish robbers. Scot was to certain races a synonym for vagabond. The Scots and Picts were simply black herds of vagabonds and painted men, black folks, in the sight of the civilized Britons. The characteristics of the wild Scots of Galloway are identical with those of the Picts or Moors of Galloway. Isn't this how they seen the Indians, guys? Oh, the savages. And the worst side of these characteristics is exemplified in the hated chief of those dubbed classes, whose abode on the island of the River Dee in Galloway is spoken of as infernal place, where many foul deeds were done, and the owner of it characterized as one of the most horrible devils that ever appeared in Scotland. It is immaterial, therefore, whether we call those older Douglases not the mixed Ruat or Tawny section, by the style of Scots or Picts. They were substantially the same, thus as Moors or Scots or Picts, right? The purest specimens of dubbed classes of Galloway were Gypsies and Faws, and a Douglas, or latterly a Black Douglas, was a generic term. This fact explains the confusion that has arisen concerning the Black Douglas. MacTaggart of the Gallovidian Encyclopedia is dreadfully mixed with regard to the chiefs of this name, for he evidently supposes that only one of them was so designated. You see? And he's pointing that out, that in a lot of these historical encyclopedias and books, they try to make it seem, oh, he was called black because he was the only black man there. No, that's not why, right? Again, all the people around him, all his descendants, and his ancestors, and his enemies, and the people they're fighting and allying with are all swarthy. He's not the only one. So these errors, right, like from MacTaggart, in good company, as Sir Walter Scott seems also to regard the good Sir James as the Black Douglas, whereas we know that no fewer than 4 of the Douglas earls bore that title, while their very clan name, strictly considered, signifies the black man. That a Black Douglas must at one time have been a term interchangeable with a black man or a gypsy, all right? I'm gonna highlight that again. Remember that. Is indicated also by the rhyme which Scott places in the mouth of the soldier's wife at Roxburgh Castle. Hush ye, little pet G. Hush ye, do not fret G. The Black Douglas shall not get G. This very rhyme is said by Simpson to be sung by mothers to their fretful children at the present day, with this significant variation. That last line runs, the black tinkler, when I get ya. All right? They mean black when they're saying the Douglas. Therefore, for this reason also, a Black Douglas was only a synonym for a Moor or a black man, a Negro. And when one or other of the chiefs of this race was styled the Black Douglas, the article so prefixed was employed exactly as it is yet done in Ireland and in Scotland to distinguish the head of the clan from the rest of his clansmen, all of whom bear the same tribal name. It has been hinted that the movement which ended in the final overthrow of the Black Douglases was a last effort of the Moorish races to recover their lost sovereignty. And there does seem some reason for believing that race hatred entered largely into the motives by which the participators in the struggle were actuated. Race motives, huh? Race hatred? Be this as it may, there is no doubt that the first celebrated Black Douglas was on the side of the Norman Bruce. But at that time, a century and a half before the Black Douglas collapsed, all difference of race was sung by every one who really wished to further the newborn desire for a united national life in Scotland. And the high-minded knight portrayed by Barber would be the last to trade upon racial spite. After this independence had been actually gained and the fever of patriotism had cooled, and when the noblest of their leaders had long been dead, it is conceivable that the attitude of the Black Douglases may have considerably altered. Or indeed, had the good Sir James been framed of baser materials like his unworthy descendants, he might have placed himself at the head of the anti Norman party, and Scotland, a large portion of which consisted of the Picts of Galloway, who were, of course, Black Douglases. Many of the people of Galloway were unfriendly to Bruce. They lived under the government of one MacDougall, related to the Lord of Lorne, who had defeated Robert Bruce at Dalry and very nearly killed or made him prisoner. These Galloway men had heard that Bruce was in their country with no more than 60 men with him, so they resolved to attack him by surprise, and for this purpose they got 200 men together and brought with them 2 or 3 bloodhounds. Now these Galloway men were, as stated, Picts, for the Picts of Galloway were popularly known as Galloway men or Galwegians. As Galwegians or Picts, they had led the van of King David's army at the Battle of the Standard, nearly 2 centuries prior to Bruce's day. Therefore, it is not to be wondered at that their leader was styled MacDougall, since that name signifies the son of the black stranger. All right? That's what it means, MacDougall. And if divisions of them were at that time or subsequently styled Douglases or MacDougalls, the names were the natural outcome of their descent from the black strangers. Whether, as Mr. Skene appears to indicate, they were the posterity of early Picts, or whether, as Scott hints, they were related to the MacDougalls of Lorne. They were literally Douglases. As Picts, as Scots, or as Black Danes, they were, in the eyes of men of the race of Gilda's black foreigners, or Dougals, the offspring of what originally were Transmarine nations. The chances are that such color names were used in a very shifty fashion, even at so recent period as the days of Bruce, and many of those Galwegians would be indifferently called Douglases, MacDougalls, or one or other of 100 various names that set off some peculiarity of complexion or of figure, or that denoted the occupation of the individual. Those Galloway men that tried to surprise Bruce then were Picts, whether they were the spray of the waves named Pictish or Scottish or Danish. And of course they were Moors, or black folks, melanated people. The splendidly graphic description of this scene given to us by Barber reveals them to us as horsemen and archers, and it shows that they, if not naked, were devoid of armor. Because when Bruce hastily decided, with even more than his usual hardihood, to defend single-handed the narrow gully in the steep bank that rose up from the fort, he encouraged himself with the reflection that he need not fear their arrows, since he was furnished with armor. And if this does little more than insinuate that his enemies were not mail-clad men, that assumption is proved to be fact by the subsequent passage, which tells how easily they were slain by the thrust of the king's spear. Again, if they were like their fellow Picts who fought Severus in the marshes of Stirlingshire, they were naked men, save for the usual loincloth. Or if they resembled their kindred in Ireland of the previous century, the wild, glibed black Irishmen described by Froissart, their only garment, the plaid or mantle, was at that moment wrapped around the left arm, and they rode their horses without saddle or stirrup. All right, like American Indians, or which is likelier still, if their manners resembled those of their own forefathers 100 years before the days of Bruce, they were devoid of any clothing whatever. As already remarked, those savage warriors were more akin to Cheyennes, listen, or Comanches, than to any variety of modern European except the Gypsy. So these people that he's talking about, right? Picts, these black Irishmen, these Douglases, these so-called Moors, they depicted more, they resembled more Cheyennes, American Indians, Comanches than any European people, except the Gypsies, because the Gypsies coming from Egypt, ancient Egypt, to marry America. And this encounter with the Christianized Norman hero was an early scene in a drama that has been enacted ever since, like their contemporary kingsmen in Ireland, or like the so called Indians on the other side of the Atlantic. Those races may be regarded as the drift of an older civilization than the Christian, and therefore savages, or not according to individual notions of civilization. But the picture of Robert Bruce defending the narrow pass above the fort has been copied over and over again, with very little variation, all over the globe. And never was the battle fought against greater odds, and the conqueror never achieved a more brilliant victory. On the one hand, the throng of mounted warriors trampling through the shallow water with wild war cries, the moonlight gleaming on their dusky skins and ruddled faces, and in front of them bestridging the narrow pathway, in the back the solitary, impregnable figure of the king. The Black Douglases of history were thus the ancestors of certain families of modern gypsies, the name of Douglas being in one of its phrases or faces an equivalent of tinkler. Their language would naturally vary to some extent, as it was influenced by circumstances such as their blending with other races, the influence of other forms of speech introduced into the country, and the inevitable attrition of time. Their nobles during the days of Black Douglas ascendancy would assuredly speak the language of chivalry and of courts. The good Sir James, while listening to the romances with which the king beguiled the time during their enforced idleness among the hills, the tales of Oliver, of worthy Farambres, and of the 12 peers of France, or while conversing with the ladies of Bruce's refugee court in the Aberdeenshire Highlands, no doubt would speak in Norman French, or in the language of his biographer, Barber, the English tongue. A result of his high birth and his wide experience must have been to make him familiar with both of these languages, to both of which his mingled ancestry may have given him an inherited claim. But in speaking to the mass of his followers, the Gillies, the Black Douglas clan, he must have employed another language. What that was may be easily surmised than ascertained, since it is confessed by scholars that so-called gypsy tongues have not hitherto received the particular attention they merit. But we shall not go very wide of the mark if we suppose that the common speech of the 14th century Pict or Black Douglases of Galloway, known locally as the Wild Scot of Galowa, was something very like the Shelta Hatti, just discovered by Mr. Leland to be at once the language of the thinkers and a dialect of the Celtic tongue. All right? Thus, the tribe to which the name of Douglas or Black Douglas eventually adhered identifies the early Scots and early Picts with one particular division of the modern Gypsies, namely those inhabiting Galloway and other districts in the south of Scotland. In a less marked degree, these races are identified with the dark whites, or Melanochroi, of the same districts, Lochmaben, which is said to be stocked with people of gypsy descent, is situated in a district peculiarly associated with the Douglases, and the other places in the same neighborhood particularized by Mr. Simon have no doubt received much of their semi-gypsy population from the Black Douglas source. But it must be remembered that this name originally meant nothing more than the black man. All right? That's what it meant. It's just talking about the so-called black man. All right? Do you understand? You hearing me right now? Are you paying attention? Yeah? Not practicing cognitive dissonance, are you? And that it only clung to one special tribe by the same accidental process that has made such names as Black, Duff, Dow, Brown, Dunn, or Dunn, Don, or Dunn, and others. All right? They all mean the black man. Become the distinguishing surname of other families. To attempt to trace the history of those various names with a view to cite them as companion examples to that of Douglas would be exceedingly tedious and unnecessary, but it may be allowable to consider one or two others that naturally present themselves before us. And noticing those Douglas lords that were unmistakably styled black because of their complexion, it was observed that one of them, a son of the good Sir James, was surnamed the Grim. And since both his father and his son bore the special epithet, the Black, attached to their ordinary names, and also because this adjective, grim, did until very lately signify black, all right? Did you guys know that? As well as ugly or stern, you know how they try to associate the color black with everything negative, right? There is every reason for believing that. In the case of this Earl, his contemporaries had merely selected an alternative adjective denoting the same quality as that which characterized his father and his son. Whether this nickname ever became the actual surname of others of his children, unknown to history, does not appear, although this is quite probable. At any rate, it did not become a very well known clan name in various parts of the country, and quite independently, so far as one may judge of this grim earl. It is difficult to learn what the earliest form of the word was. Dr. Armstrong gives an obsolete Gaelic grim, meaning war, and also gruama, morose, dark, gloomy, while Professor Skeet includes gram, wrathful, and grim, ugly, grim, along with the kindred grim or grum, lamp black, grim, among Danish roots. The antiquary Pinkerton, or Pinkerton, sorry, derives the name of the Grampian Hills from the Danish gram, a warrior. All of these meanings could no doubt be reconciled. If the name was originally the property of the Danes or other Dub Gauls, to whom it signified war and warrior, it is easy to see how the same word would mean to their opponents once they became acquainted with it: ugly, wrathful, and black. And the chief features of those black strangers, wherever we get a sight of them, from the opposite side in history or tradition, and that its signification of black survived until a generation ago, was shown by two quotations on a previous page. The chief associations of the word then were blackness, ugliness, and surliness, and its history in this country seems clearly to prove its connection with one division or another of the black foreigners. The wall that Antonius built between the firths of Forth and Clyde to keep back the Scoto Pictish Moors is popularly known as the Grim's Dyke. In the counties of Hampshire, Wilts, and Berks, a similar wall with a somewhat similar history is locally called the Grim's Dyke. A Carr Dyke in Norfolk, and at least two other black dykes in Scotland have apparently all received their names for similar reasons: Grim, Carr, Celt, Kiar, Car, or Ker, remember Cara means black, and black, all denoting the complexion of the people against whom, or possibly by whom, they were erected. All right, again, all that means so called black. Grimsby, Grimsthorpe, Grimsbury in England, and Grimsay in the Orkneys are some examples of bays, thorps, boroughs, and islands once noted as the resort of such Grims. At the eastern end of the Scottish Grim's Dyke, or Graham, right? Graham Dyke, that means so called black too, for the word is thus variously spelled. And on the northern or Pictish side of the wall, there is a Grahamstown. It is situated in a district which has been very closely associated with the Moors from the earliest times. Graham, huh? This neighborhood, now dry land, was the habitat of the Pictish marsh dwellers against whom Severus fought. Those swarthy, all right, swarthy, almost naked savages who fought like modern Zulus, just like Zulus, huh? With spears, like modern Zulus with spears and long, narrow shields, all right? Who, like modern Eskimos or North Siberians, shot their light skinned canoes through the intricate channels of this Scythian vale and swarmed in a black herd across the wall. Here it was the great Pictish king, tattooed Donald, fell in battle in the year 642. Beside this Grimstown once stood the temple that was known to another people as the Fa Kirk or Iglis Brak, the Church of the Speckled People. And even at this remote day, some of their vagabond descendants still range the district, one clan of them still bearing the appellative name of Grimy, while two of the most distinctive gypsy industries, mugging and tinkering, have developed possibly in other hands into celebrated pottery and ironworks of Dunmore and Carron, situated in the neighborhood of this Grimes town. Those Grimes being Moors, blacks, browns, cars, dows or doves, dub glasses, dub gulls, and falls. All right, all these families are so-called Moors or so-called black. Many or may readily have branched out into numerous families bearing those names, which, though at first appellative, would gradually become fossilized into ordinary surnames, devoid of any literal meaning. This no doubt has happened, but we are considering them at a date prior to the era when their names had reached the fossil stage, at a date when a Grammy was so known because he was a grim or black man, a Moor, all right? That's why he was a grim, Graham, because he was a black man or a Moor, a dark complexioned person. Speaking of this Grams of the fourth marshes, Dr. Jameson says in a note to his edition of Blind Harry's Wallace, a fabulous antiquity has been ascribed to this family, it having been asserted that the wall of Antonine vulgarly received the name of Graham's Dyke because in a very early period of our history it was penetrated by a valorous chief from whom those of this celebrated name had their origin. It is scarcely correct, perhaps, to say that Dr. Jameson is speaking of the marsh-dwelling Grims. At the period to which he refers, the 13th century, the marshes of Stirlingshire were becoming dry land, and the Maetai or marsh dwellers were under the rule of an alien race. And it is of that later race that Jameson is thinking when he speaks of this family. Its founder appears to have been one of the Anglo-Norman followers of David I of Scotland during the 12th century, and his title of de Grami probably signified nothing more than that, like the first de Moravia, who ruled over a territory of Gramis or Moors. One of the descendants of this William de Grami was the celebrated Sir John de Grami, the devoted companion of Wallace, and his complexion is denoted by Henry the Minstrel's reference to his pale face as he lay dead. However, it is likely enough that this ruling caste may have afterwards intermarried with the subject race, as the Norman MacLelans are reported to have done with the subject MacRoss of the North. At first they appear to have allied themselves with fellow Normans, but it is probable that rulers and ruled would become, to some extent, mingled, so that the traditional connection between their clan name and the Grimes Dyke, Black Dyke, Moors Dyke, or Picts Dyke would be correct enough, so far as one division of their ancestry was concerned. Mr. Simpson has a good deal to say of the Gypsies of Stirlingshire and that neighborhood and of their fierce Moravian habits. And the present writer has been informed by a man who lived in the town of Stirling during the early years of this century that not only did they indulge in savage fights at the weekly markets held in that town, but that on one occasion they took forcible possession of several outlying farmhouses, from which they were eventually ousted by the town guard of Stirling, then a somewhat important entity. Their haunts at that period were the Moses and Moors of the Menteith district of Sheriffmore, of the Ochils, and of the Lommonds. It would appear from Scott that the Grimies of the debatable land were the descendants of those of the 4th district. Their chief, he says, claimed his descent from Mallis, Earl of Strathern. The same writer has often referred to them and their wild, intractable nature in several of his writings. As most people know, their territory is described as a tract of land. chiefly level and of a Maori character, but now in course of improvements on the western border of England and Scotland, the upper half adjudged in 1542 to Scotland and the more eastern part to England. Yet the debatable land continued long after the residence of the Daves and banditti, to whom its dubious state had afforded a refuge. After the ascension of James VI of Scotland to the English throne, a sweeping clearance of the Scottish border was effected. At the same time, the debatable land was cleared of the Grymies, a daring sept of freebooters who were transported to Ireland and their return prohibited under pain of death. Thenceforward, coming under the heading of wild Irishmen, dubbed Airianach, or to use an expression equally inexact, black Celts, or otherwise as Irish Gypsies. As in Stirlingshire and in Scotland generally, there floated upward from this mass of Grymies an element of refinement, of education, and of chivalry, which, along with all that was best in 1,000 other British tribes, has constituted the educated population of the British Islands. But with these we have nothing to do here. Whatever the marsh-dwelling grimy blood they may have inherited has been so mixed with that of other races, and its original character has been so completely refined away, that even could any one of this sort prove a descent from the Moors, are they the same people that crossed the wall of Antoninus? It would be impossible to regard such a one as representative of those archaic Picts, since the same man cannot represent both the 2nd century and the 19th century. Not that it can be said that Gypsies even represent a period so far back as the 2nd century, but at last they are many generations behind their fellow countrymen. The whole of the Grymies of the debatable land cannot have been sent into Ireland in the reign of James I, because they still retain their hold upon those uncultivated tracts until the time of George III, if not later. During the latter half of the last century, Lord Tankerville and others of the border magistracy proceeded one day to survey, for the purposes of settlement and agriculture, some uncultivated land called the plea lands, or debatable lands, the pasturage of which was generally eaten up by the sorners and vagabonds on both sides of the marches. By threats and entreaties, and chief of these tribes and their followers had been induced to keep away from the scene of action, but they stationed themselves on the higher grounds not far off, from which position they watched the proceedings. At first they were very quiet, but when they saw the English court book spread out on a cushion before the clerk and apparently taken in a line of direction, interfering with what they considered to be their privileged ground, it was with great difficulty that the most moderate of them could restrain the rest from running down and taking vengeance, even in sight of their own lord of the manor. In quotes, they only abstained for a short time, and no sooner had Sir David Bennet and the other gentlemen taken leave of each other, and had departed to a sufficient distance than the clan, armed with bludgeons, pitchforks, and such other hostile weapons as they could find, rushed down in a body, and before the chiefs, the modern gentry, on either side, had reached their home. There was neither English tenant, horse, cow, nor sheep left upon the premises. Scenes of this description are taking place today in New Zealand, and in either country it is the protest of the savage against civilization, of the native man against those who would wrest from him the fatherland of his race. All these examples have been taken as specimens of early Scottish, Pictish, or Danish tribes. Necessarily, there must be uncertainty as to the exact pedigree, but since all three branches were connected, or at least since none were of the Centro-Croic type, their particular lineage is so far of little importance. The Douglases, however, were brought out to show that while the early Scots were seen in the mass to be akin to the early Picts, so individual cases might be found proving the same thing. But since the trees of families and tribes cannot be traced authentically to a period prior to the latest invasion of Dugals, that of the Black Danes, all right? The Black Danes, Black Vikings. Neither Douglases nor Grammies can be accepted as positively proven the swarthy complexion of the early Scots. Nevertheless, it is manifest that the Black Douglases, the Galwegians proper or Galloway Picts, and the wild Scots of Ogalloway were one and the same people. In this way, the Douglases, as a tribe of Scots, demonstrate that the early Scots were Moors or dark complexioned people, or as we now call them, Gypsies. The Gypsies were originally Swarthy, guys. Check out my Gypsy video. There must thus have been Scots in the one acceptation of the word, and that the oldest, they were wild piratical marauders, whether by land or sea. In the other and more Catholic sense, they were the ordinary inhabitants of modern Scotland. There is nothing exceptional in such a twofold use of the same word. When one talks today of a New Zealander, it is not a matter of certainty that the word is not used as Macaulay used it. Australians are either colonists or aborigines, according to the nature of the society in which the word is uttered. In a club of squatters, the former meaning is taken for granted. At an ethnological meeting, the latter is as naturally assumed. It is not so very long ago that an American meant a red Indian. All right, pay attention, or the copper colored tribes of America. Wesley, I believe, somewhere calls the native people dark Americans. Okay? And this distinction of Wesley's corresponds exactly with that existent between Irishman itself, a far too comprehensive word, and wild Irishman, which in Gaelic, black Irishmen. Okay? Dark Americans, talking about Indians, talking about Picts. Are they the same people? We're getting to that. Accordingly, we find that Scottish people generally have traditions of a fierce Galwegian race, whom they, though Scots and indeed Galwegians themselves, in the widest sense of those terms, remember especially as the wild Scots of Galloway, a as shameless Irish robbers or early Scots, as pigs of Galloway, and as Black Douglases. Those people were Moors or Gypsies, as just stated, okay? And they don't just mean Muslim Moor from North Africa and Moorish invasions. Gosh, the hijack. Not everybody is a Moor. I mean, sorry, not everybody that's black in Europe is not a Moor. How they make us think Moors only are, right? If that makes sense. Sorry if it doesn't. There is no doubt that Scot has been used in a national sense for very long. Barber, who wrote in the English tongue at that time, the days of Chaucer, scarcely a whit different from modern English, speaks of Scottish and Englishmen in the same comprehensive geographical way as we now do. The Picts or wild Scots of Galloway, he distinguishes as Galloways, but although this usage dates so far back, yet the word Scot had a definite restricted signification nearly 3 centuries after Barber wrote. This is seen from the following newspaper paragraph written at Edinburgh in the year 1662. The Scots and Moss troopers have again revived their old custom of robbing and murdering the English, whether soldier or other, upon all opportunities. Within these 3 weeks, we have had notice of several robberies and murders committed by them. Among the rest, a lieutenant and one other of Colonel Irvington's regiment, returning from England, were robbed not far from Dunbar. A lieutenant lately master of the customs of Kirkcudbright was killed about 20 miles from this place, and 4 foot soldiers of Colonel Overton's were killed, going to their quarters by some Mosers, who, after they had given them quarter, tied their hands behind them, and then threw them down a steep hill or rock, as it was related by a Scotchman who was with them but escaped. Here the distinction between Scots and Scotchmen is marked. The first are the associates of Mossers or Moss troopers are Mossers or Moss troopers. The others are peaceable lieges. Though written at Edinburgh, the paragraph uses the pronoun them in speaking of the Scots. In short, a Scot and a moss trooper or moser were synonymous terms in 1662. But what manner of men were mossers or moss troopers? The same newspaper records in the following year that the Parliament, October 21st, passed an act declaring any person that shall discover any felon or felons commonly known or called by the name of moss troopers, residing upon the borders of England and Scotland, shall have a reward of £10 upon their conviction. The mossers then were felons. They are further described by Sir Walter Scott in these terms. But on the middle and western marches, the inhabitants were unrestrained moss troopers and cattle drivers, knowing no measure of law, says Camden, but the length of their swords. Various proclamations were in vain issued for interdicting the use of horses and arms upon the west border of England and Scotland. The evil was found to require the radical cure of extirpation. Buccleuch collected under his banners the most desperate of the border warriors, of whom he formed a legion for the service of the states of Holland, who had as much reason to rejoice on their arrival upon the continent as Britain to congratulate herself upon their departure. It may be presumed that few of this corps ever returned to their native country. The clan of the Grime, a hardy and ferocious sept of freebooters, inhabiting chiefly the debatable land, by a very summary exertion of authority, was transported to Ireland, and their return prohibited under pain of death. Numbers of border riders were executed, without even the formality of a trial, and it is even said that in mockery of justice, assizes were held upon them after they had suffered. By this rigor, though sternly and unconscientiously exercised, the border marauders were in the course of years either reclaimed or exterminated, though nearly a century elapsed ere their manners were altogether assimilated to those of their countrymen. Those moss troopers or mossers are thus revealed to us as a race of men so different from the civilized inhabitants of Scotland that the bulk of them could not be tolerated, but were either killed or transported, while those that succeeded in clinging to their native land did not become civilized until the process of assimilation had been going on for 3 generations. Now, as I'm reading this, I just had a wild thought. So they're saying, you see how they're saying they were transported outside the country. Remember that in my slave videos, a lot of people coming from Scotland and Ireland as indentured servants or slaves, for life, indentures for life, going into coal mines or even the plantations, the sugar plantations. I picture people like this being captured, right? These so-called moss troopers, these black, wild Irish, Gypsy, Moorish, Douglases, right? These marsh dwellers, what they call Moors, being captured, being sent to their plantations, sugar plantations, even into the Caribbean, right? We know this is true. We know this is historic. And you see how wild and rebellious they are. Well, they call them wild, but rebellious they are. Wouldn't they try to escape over there too, and also become what do you call it? Maroons, and go to the mountains just like the Indians do? And that's what I'll be trying to say a lot of times in my previous videos, where I'm trying to mention that, and this is what I'm trying to picture you guys. So these kind of people given so much trouble that can't be tolerated, a lot of these get transported to the plantations, and over there they ain't going to be tolerated either. They're going to be rebellious too. A lot of them become runaways, and these are some of your people in your maroon communities. It's not just Indians. That's what I'm trying to say, all right? The treatment they received was so analogous to that experience by their kindred across the Atlantic, that the experience, sorry, that resemblance hardly needs to be pointed out. All right? It's saying parents just like the Indians. This is distinctly visible as far back as the 12th century. They appear just like Indians. At that time, Dr. Skene tells us the country of the Moors or Moray men of the north was colonized by Norman Dutch people under the supervision of David I and his grandson and successor, Malcolm the Fourth, all right, known to be Swarthy. So you see all sides, all these people, Swarthy, the native Moors or Indians, the native Moors or Indians who may have been of early Pictish or of Danish stock, you don't know, or Dan Danish, Dan Dane, were first overcome after many severe conflicts. Indians, huh? When this was finally accomplished, Malcolm IV removed them all from the land of their birth and scattered them throughout the other districts of Scotland, both beyond the hills and on this side thereof, so that not even a native of the land abode there. And he installed therein his own peaceful people. They got scattered, huh? In transatlantic parlance, the Indians were placed upon reservations, and the country opened up for settlement by people who were presumably, if not certainly, fair whites, dodged a hijack, free white, included Moors, in the main, and whose ideas of life were in essence the same as those held by our modern colonists. This Malcolm IV had at the same time many encounters with the painted Moors of Galloway, whose descendants a century and a half later were momentarily discerned assailing King Robert Bruce, all right, at the river bank. By the year 1587, such people were wholly forbidden from entering the districts occupied by the civilized inhabitants of Scotland, unless they could find security for their quiet deportment, just as Indians are permitted to leave their reservations after receiving a pass from the authorities. But in the following century, owing to a temporary dominance of the intolerant and merciless spirit that is yet displayed by the white rowdies of the vast vanishing frontier in the United States, dodged the hijack with white, they mean Europeans, those Moors that still infested the borders were subjected, as we have seen, to a more despotic treatment. Some were formed into regiments like the Hungarian Gypsies mentioned by Simpson, all right, just like the Hungarian Moors, and sent to find a speedy death in continental battles. Others, as for instance those specially known as Grammies, were deported to Ireland. Then, in some parts of a species of Indian territory, okay, I told you they were sent over there, and others, like many an ill-starred pagan or Seminole, were killed without any show of mercy or justice. Their habits are thus further described. They are stated to have ridden horses of a small size, but astonishingly nimble, and trained to move by short bounds through the morasses. Those horses were variously styled Galloway nags and Irish hobbies by the contemporary non-moss trooping population, and they seem to have been akin to a small breeds of Orkney, Shetland, and Hebrides. Their riders were so much accustomed to move on horseback that they held it even mean to appear otherwise. Hence the name of prickers and hobblers so frequently applied to them. Camden, writing in the 16th century, says of them, they sally out of their own borders in troops through unfrequented byways and many intricate windings. All the daytime they refresh themselves and their horses in lurking holes they had pitched upon before, till they arrive in the dark at those places they have a design upon. As soon as they have seized upon the booty, they in like manner return home in the night through blind ways, fetching many a compass. Like Falstaff, says Sir Walter Scott, they were gentlemen of the night, minions of the moon, under whose countenance they committed their predations. The surnames which gradually became attached to various subdivisions of those monsters are many. One of the personages in a curious drama by Sir David Lindsay mentions several of these. The speaker is himself a moss trooper, about to be hanged, and in his dying speech he is made to apostrophize his fellow moss troopers. Thus, adieu, all thieves, that me Belanges, Belois, Erinis, and Elawandis, speedy affliction, slight of Hundies, the Scots of Isdale and the Grammies, I have not time to tell you namis. Of these names, the first is regarded by Mr. Simpson as peculiarly a gypsy name. It is borne by two Egyptians, or Baz, named in an act of James V, quoted in the history of the Gypsies. It is said to be the same as Bailey, And if so, it suggests a descent from the form Belial, which also has been changed to Bailey. The Belials is the act of James V, are there stated to be false and Egyptians. They were also using the names literally Moors, Douglases, Grammys, and Scots by virtue of their complexion. Literally, he's telling you Scots, man, our complexion. Listen, man. Now, this last surname reminds one of a curious fact, namely that the very man who has written so much about the borderers was himself by descent of this identical race of early Scots. He had without doubt inherited the blood of 20 other races, but he inherited his surname from the Moravian Scots of the 4th century, who were, in the estimation of their Christianized contemporaries, so many black herds of shameless Irish robbers. If with the surname of Scott or Scott, he had also inherited the blood of the founder of the clan, particularly named Scots, then the most illustrious bearer of that name was in some degree of the Scythian origin, Saxon Scythian, sons of Isaac origin. This is seen not only by regarding the manners of the Scots proper, whether as early Scots or as later moss troopers, but also by examining the alleged origin of the Scot clan. They are understood to be descended from John of Galloway, one of two brethren natives of Galloway, who were banished from that country for a riot or insurrection during the latter part of the 9th century. It is likely enough that this riot or insurrection was one of many others taking place at that time in Galloway, and resulting in the possession of the throne of Alban by Kenneth MacAlpin. All right, again, a swarthy man historically known as a so-called black man. All right, Kenneth MacAlpin. Come on, look it up, do the research. Who seems to have been strongly supported by the Scots of Galloway, from which district indeed he himself is said to have come. At any rate, Kenneth MacAlpin is the king who is stated in the family legend to have transformed this Galloway Scot into John Scott of Buccleuch. Thus, the tradition that draws the origin of the Selkirkshire Scots from the Wild Scots of Galloway is strictly in keeping with the characters of both races. What the Scots or Picts of Galloway were like, we have already seen, and Sir Walter has himself acquainted us with the chief features of their posterity in Selkirkshire, all right? He means, yeah, they were so called black. He shows us that a Scot and a moss trooper were once synonymous terms, all right? All swarthy people. This indeed is a fact that is recognized everywhere. The Scots of the south of Scotland, says the author of the Scottish Nation, were among the most noted moss troopers of their time, sorry. And of one branch of this clan, the same writer says, the Scots of Tushila and Ettrick, at one period a powerful section of the clan Scot, were like all the race reavers and freebooters. The exploits of Adam Scott of Tushila, one of the most famous of their chiefs and usually called King of the Thieves and King of the Border, with the excesses of the other border barons, roused the wrath of James V, and in 1528 he made proclamation to all lords, barons, gentlemen, landwardmen, and freeholders that they should compare at Edinburgh with a month's victuals to pass with the kings where he pleased to Danton, the thieves of Teviotdale, Annandale, Liddesdale, and other parts of that country, and also warned all gentlemen that had good dogs to bring them, that he might hunt in the said country as he pleased. In the course of this excursion, guided by some of the borderers, the king penetrated into the inmost recesses of Usedale and Teviotdale, and seasoned Cockburn of Henderland and Scott of Tushila one morning before breakfast, summarily hung them in front of their own strongholds. This proclamation of James V was made about 70 years after James II's fiat uttered for the breaking up of the Black Douglas League, and it can scarcely be doubted that many of the remnants of that broken clan formed no inconsiderable portion of the thieves of Teviotdale, Annandale, and Liddesdale. And just as the once powerful black Douglases of history are preserved in the popular memory of Moors or Gypsies, so were their representatives 2 generations later, known as thieves and moss troopers, one of their principal leaders being styled the King of Thieves, a term that in the 16th century was synonymous with King of the Gypsies. All right? In short, it is difficult to find any distinction between the edicts issued 2 or 3 centuries ago against thieves, moss troopers, and the like, and those issued against Egyptians. All right? Gypsies, Egyptians from Tamari, ancient America. And it is almost certain that a study of such ancient acts would disclose the fact that no real difference between the two ever existed. Proclamation shall be made, quotes Scott from the Proceedings of the Border Commissioners from 1505, that all inhabitant within Tynedale and Ridsdale and Northumberland, east and west, Teviotdale, Liddesdale, Exdale, Ewesdale, and Annesdale in Scotland, saving noblemen and gentlemen unsuspected of felony and theft, and not being of broken clans, and their household servants dwelling within those several places before recited, shall put away all armor and weapons, and shall not keep any horse, upon the time pain of imprisonment. This proclamation was made fully 20 years before James V made his raid upon the border thieves, whose sheaves he summarily disposed of. It is observable that a distinct line is drawn between the members of broken clans and those who were men of good repute, and it is under the former heading that such tribes as the now vanquished black Douglases fall to be placed. That this line of demarcation did, to a great extent, define a difference of race is most likely the broken clans and thieves, on one hand representing the last remnants of Pictish nationality, and the king's men, like the MacLellans of the previous century, representing the Normanized governing power. By acts subsequent to those just cited and issued in the later years of the 16th century, such clans as had no chieftain of sufficient note to enter bail for their quiet conduct became broken men, outlawed to both nations. All right, they had no leaders. They were, in truth, says the same distinguished writer, a kind of outcast, again, whom the united powers of England and Scotland were often employed. In short, ever since the overthrow of the black nobility in 1455, black nobility, or to go far farther back, ever since the 10th century, when a so-called white king displaced a black one on the Pictish throne, if that's because he's calling the Normans and Flemings white, all right? So that's why I say dodge the hijack. He might have been melanated as well. So the Pictish throne, right? Those Moors who refused to accept the laws of the new civilization and who refrained from mixing their blood with that of the other nations had been sinking lower and lower in the social scale until in the 16th century they had become outlawed banditti, mosers, or gypsies. But remember, the people persecuting them were also melanated. This is what I'm saying. Don't get confused. The ascension of James of Scotland to the British throne marked, says Scott, as already mentioned, a crisis in the state of affairs on the borders. All right, James of Scotland, all these people of Swarthy, we've gone over this, remember. The moss troopers were sent as soldiers to Holland, were transported for life to Ireland, and in many cases were hunted down in their own country without mercy. Again, a lot of these people ended up in the plantations of America. At exactly the same period, says Mr. Simpson, the gypsies received the same treatment. In the words of Baron Hume, all ordinary means having proved insufficient to restrain so numerous and so sturdy a crew, the Privy Council at length in June 1603 were induced to venture on the more effectual expedient of at once ordering the whole race to leave the kingdom by a certain day, and never to return under the pain of death. The moss trooping Grimes, or black men, had been transported to Ireland for the rest of their natural lives. Speaking of them and other border moss troopers, a 17th century writer says, they dwell in the bounds or meeting of the two kingdoms, but obey the laws of neither. Amounting 40 years since two some thousand, They compelled the vicinage to purchase their security by paying a constant rent to them, blackmail. But being now declared outlaws and having lost all their former power, thenceforward after that they are outlawed. You see, now they're outlaws because they're outside the law. They're not part of the law or part of the government. And now they're being blackmailed because they are so called black. They wear a wolf's head so that they lawfully may be destroyed without any judicial inquisition, as who carry their own condemnation about them, and deservedly die without law because they refuse to live according to law. Thus, of the moss troopers, speaking of gypsies, Mr. Simpson states that by a statute of 1609 it was declared lawful to condemn and execute them to death upon proof made of the single fact that they are called, known, repute, and holden Egyptians. All right. From ancient to merry, ancient America, gypsies, that's what I said. Who's the Picts? The Act of 1609 deals with common thieves, commonly called Egyptians. All right. They're calling them Egyptians, guys, literally in history and historical records. We ain't just making this up. And 3 years later, the king entered into a contract with the clan Scott and their friends by which the clan bound themselves to give up all bands of friendship, kindness, oversight, maintenance, or assurance, if any we have with common thieves and broken clans. A chief of that clan, Scott or Tushila, had in the previous century been known as the king of the thieves, and as such hanged before his own door. He may be taken as one of the latest specimens of the gypsy who yet retained the rank of his ancestors, who was a pure-blooded Scot, a chief of a minor clan, the holder of a territorial title, and yet the king of the gypsies. And his person one sees the decay of his race illustrated. Born the chief of a clan, yet distinguished by its historical surname, he was hanged as a common thief, a mosser, a gypsy. A genuine Scot, like a genuine Douglas, was thus of the mingled people whom we now call gypsies. While the Scots remain tolerably pure in blood, we do not usually see them styled gypsies. At that period, their precision and power was so great that it was national and historical. During that period, therefore, they are known by their historical name. But whatever they declined to the grade of broken clans, as did the Black Douglases in 1455 and Scott of Tushila a century later, they are styled common thieves, commonly called Egyptians. And they're not talking about modern Egypt. Gosh, your own hijacks. The exact date when the popular name began to be used in the statutes can only be learned by painful research. But it must have been a popular name for many centuries, since Dr. Skene tells us that the pedigree of the early Scots of history was deduced by some from an Egyptian source. All right, Egyptian source, the early Scots. Let's get that whole thing, okay? You guys see that? Remember what we've read? And remember when they say Egyptian source coming out of Egypt, Exodus, right? Coming out of Egypt. Many people came out of the land of Egypt, ancient America. However, we are at present trying to limit our gaze to the border Scots. Apart from the general race of early Scots throughout these islands, we have seen that a contemporary writer describes the borderers as always making their expeditions during the night and lying in concealment during the day. This Sir Walter also corroborates, and it is also characteristic of the Black Morrow or Blackymore of Galloway tradition, who may have been of the Black Douglas clan. It is a characteristic also of all the black men, once so greatly feared by timorous peasant girls and young children, although such black men, as belonging to a distinct type, are now non-existent, or nearly so. Such black robbers were all, in the often quoted words of Falstaff, minions of the moon. Hence the emblematic moons and stars, says Scott, so frequently charged in the arms of border families. Now this is precisely one of the distinguishing features of the Gypsies. Washington's Irving's Starlight Tomb was no exceptional Gypsy. The name by which they are known in the Cant language is moonmen. Thus, in this particular, as in so many others, the Scots proper are seen to be a division of the Gypsy race. It may be remembered that the Black Douglases of 1455 are not only styled Moors, all right, in local tradition, but also Saracens, people of dark complexion, sons of Sarah, Abraham, huh? Sons of Sarah, Saracens. Now, there was probably some difference between a Moor and a Saracen, although in heraldry there does not seem to be much distinction. There is a lot of difference if you're just trying to make them North African Muslims, right? And the Algerine pirates, who made occasional descents upon our coasts, were probably the latest wearers of this title. Now, they're the ones got the Moor or Saracen title. He's saying the opinion which has been most generally supported and prevails at the present time is that the word was originally Sharkin, an Arabian word signifying Eastern people. Maps are flipped, right? And used in the contradiction to Maghreb or Western people, the Moors of Morocco. While therefore all Saracens were Moors, all Moors were not necessarily Saracens, okay? That's what I've been trying to tell you. Just because somebody's being referred to as a Moor in Europe doesn't mean he's a Saracen or a North African, a Muslim or from West or from the Maghreb or Morocco. All right, big one right there. Take notes. But at any rate, the term Saracen has been applied to the piratical invaders of this country for a very early period. It's just been applied. It has also been applied to the continent to various races, one of which the article quoted from the Encyclopedia Britannica identifies with gypsies. So that when the Scots or gypsies of the borders were distinguished by the Saracenic symbols of crescents and stars, listen, crescent moon and stars, such symbols were quite in accordance with their supposed descent from such Saracens and Moors as the Scots and Picts of Galloway. It is necessary, however, to defer to another chapter the consideration of such people under the designation of Saracens. He's going to break that down in another chapter, even better, so you don't get confused with the actual Saracens from North Africa or the Maghreb or Morocco. One of the oldest branches of the clan Scot or Scot is that of Murdochston or Murdiston. And this is very appropriate, for it was noticed in quoting from Elder's letter to Henry VIII that Murdoch, Murdhow, and Murdub were all forms of the same word, and that word is applied to a black warrior. All right, all this applied to a black warrior in the West Highland Tales. A black warrior, being in this case simply an appellative name, for Moor dub is Black Moor, Morrow, or Moree. Therefore, that the Black Moor's town should become the headquarters of an early Scottish chief is not a matter for surprise. Yeah, they were Swarthy. Similarly, another branch of the same clan, also of ancient lineage, was a Scot of Fosside, which of course was only another name for Murdochston. The name of Scot has thus come to signify three different kinds of Scots. First, the piratical Scot of the early centuries, who was in the main one with the wild Scot of Galloway and the moss-trooping Scot or Gypsy of later times. Then, the Scot of Selkirkshire, right? This is the second one, who eventually changed himself to repeated intermarriages with other races into something very different from the pure-blooded Scot, whom at last he came to repudiate altogether as a common thief or Egyptian. And lastly, the Scot of Scotland, who may be the descendant of any one of the numerous races that have settled in Scotland since ever it rose out of the sea. The precise date at which the Scot became a Scot must differ greatly in the various branches of that clan. It is pretty clear, however, that when the chiefs of the Selkirkshire families began to wear their ancestral crescents as feudal coats of arms, right? We've shown a lot of these crests, right? With what I was showing, what appears to be a crescent moon and a star, right? The hour has struck for their acceptance of Norman ideas, like Norman blood. David the First, It is stated by the very eminent historian already quoted, introduced feudal ideas and new blood into Scotland. And with very little alteration, these ideas and men of that blood ruled the country for many centuries. Therefore, when an anti-feudal Scot accepted a coat of arms authorized by a Norman Scottish Lion King, he showed his acquiescence in the new state of things and his support of the new dynasty. And doing this, he naturally allied himself with the gentry of the new regime, thereby casting off to a great extent the associations of his Scoto-Pictish ancestry. As a matter of fact, the present titular representative of the traditional Galloway John is as much Norman as anything else, but it is not necessary to select individual examples in order to see that the leaders of that or of any other tribe in a conquered country, that is, conquered socially and racially, whether by form of arms or not, must of necessity become the soonest blended with other races. The higher the position of the chief, the more likely was this to happen, for his birth and power gave him a political importance, which brought him into contact with the leading men of other races. And in the case of Scotland, the races that ruled the country in and after the 12th century were not of early Scottish descent. On the other hand, the humbler followers of such a chief, living in their hereditary fashion and associating only with those of kindred blood, remained the purest representatives of the ancestral stock. All right? Had the great magician been descended from none but the moss troopers he loved so much to write about, and had such of them as really were his ancestors belonged to the moiety that refused to assimilate their manners to those of their countrymen, not kinsmen, his magic would have been nothing greater than that of the dusky fortune tellers, jugglers, and mountebanks, who were his 20th cousins. But since his early Scottish forefathers one day realized the fact that if they wished to hand down their possessions and influence to future generations, they must become civilized, so called, right? And live according to the new ideas brought in or resuscitated. But the 12th century, since they recognized this and acted accordingly, their greatest descendant became what he was. Of those among the lower ranks of the Scots, to whom his choice or this choice of be civilized or perish presented itself, their very obscurity prevents one from tracing them. But the black butcher, on Teal's side, in the story of Simple John, referred to previously, may be taken as a sample of those who made the wiser choice, while the traditional black moral of Galloway as clearly represents the intractable and savage marauder who died a marauder's death. There still it is true, remain a party of compromise. Those who deprived by statute of their arms and horses still clung to their vagrant ways as comparatively harmless gypsies, but it was only so long as they behaved themselves quietly that they were permitted to exist thus. It would be tedious to quote many cases in which the more ferocious of these border clans were subjected to a relentless persecution. Scott tells us of one tribe, the Winters, that only 80 or 90 years ago, finding their own side of the border, the English side, too hot for them, crossed into Scotland, and from thence were driven back into their native country. The dalesmen of Reedwater showed great reluctance to receive these returned emigrants. After the Sunday service at a little chapel near Otterburn, one of the squires rose and, addressing the congregation, told them they would be accounted no longer Reedsdale men, but Reedsdale women, if they permitted this marked and atrocious family to enter their district. The people answered that they would not permit them to come that way, and the proscribed family, hearing of the unanimous resolution to oppose their passage, went more southernly by the heads of the Tyne, and I never heard more of them, adds Scott, but I have little doubt they are all hanged. Again, we are told that immediately after the accession of James VI of Scotland to the English crown, a period 200 years earlier than that to which Scott refers, he issued the following proclamation, dated December 4th, 1603. Divers borderers, especially the Grahams, having perpetrated sundry outrages or outrageous, but the Grahams are now at our mercy, confessing themselves to be no meet persons to live in those countries, and therefore have humbly besought us that they might be removed to some other parts, where with our gracious favor they hope to live to become new men and to deserve our mercy. We have rather inclined to this course as more agreeable to our nature than taking so much blood. This for the present proceedeth from no alteration of our detestation of such crimes, but from the lack of means to provide for the transplantation of the Grahams, to the intent that their lands be inhabited by others of good and honest conversation. For the ease of the prisons we dismiss the vulgar sort of them, retaining their heads and principles for pledges that they shall be forthcoming, and for their good behavior in the meantime. The Cumbrians, sympathizing with their sovereign laudable anxiety to free the country of such pests, entered into a subscription which, amounting to £400, they were enabled to freight 3 vessels from Workington, and which were shipped a number of the Grahams, all right, the Cumbrians, Cimmerians, shipping out Grahams, oh, dark complexion people, who were transported to Ireland. A few years later, 2 Limers of the same neighborhood, Fergus, Graham, and Plump, and Scarlett, Davy Johnston, are accused of murdering the provost of Dumfries, uncle to the 6th Lord Herries. All right, so again, you see all these deportations into Ireland. Now, remember what we read about, when my slave videos. A lot of these people that were being brought to America from Ireland originally had been taken to Ireland from Scotland, England, and other parts of Europe. So a lot of these people are being eventually shipped to the Americas from Ireland, guys. That all these borderers were of the same description is evident. The Winters were Gypsies, the Grahams were Limers, and both were accordingly Grimes or Grimes, Moors, Douglases or Douglases. And like the Moors of 12th century Moray, or those of 19th century America, listen, they were killed, transplanted, or placed upon reservations. He's calling the Indians Moors. He means the dark complexion indigenous people of these lands. All right? That's what he's not just calling them North Africans, Muslims. He don't mean that when he's saying Moors, right? He's clearly telling you, right? Just like the 19th century American Indians who were killed, transplanted, or placed upon reservations to make room for people who, if not fully entitled to be styled peaceful, were at least not persistent, combative. But the Gypsy tribe, which ought to be the most emphatically pointed to in this chapter, is that one which was particularly distinguished by the descriptive name of Douglas or Douglas, while all black swarthy people were, properly speaking, Douglases. Listen, all right? It means black man. It seems clear that this title gradually settled down upon one special sept, whose least hybrid descendants were later on specified as Black Douglases. These again may have branched off into separate families, bearing other names. The posterity of Archibald the Grim may have become Grimes or Grimes. Others may have been the founders of clans known by various surnames of various origin, other than Douglas. But even after the complete overthrow of the Black Douglas League in the latter half of the 15th century, there must have survived straggling bands of Douglases who were still Moors in complexion. Moors in complexion. They're just talking about complexion. Like him of the Bombay tradition, or to put it conversely, it is probable that while many of those Douglases or Douglases would in course of time be known by other surnames such as Black, Brown, Moore, Murray, Spa, Young, Gordon, etc. All right, all swarthy people. The original name would long adhere to a portion of the original stock, and this was so. The Black Douglases, so called, seem to have lingered on among the fastnesses of Liddesdale that border upon the scene of their great defeat at Langholm, Arkenholm, in the year 1455, for many generations after that event. and their descendants, whether wild or tame, pure-blooded or half-caste, were still dense when Scott began his famous raids into Liddensdale nearly 100 years ago. He went there to pick up some of the ancient writing ballads, said to be still preserved among the descendants of the moss troopers who had followed the banner of the Douglases. And these writing ballads, we are told by Mr. Simpson, were forever in the mouths of those border minstrels and moss troopers whom he styles gypsies. To what extent those Liddensdale folk or last century were inheritors of the early Black Douglas blood is uncertain. But if we travel a little farther along the borderline in a northeasterly direction, we come to a district which has been among the last to yield up its ancient character, in which the Black Douglases still remain as a strongly marked type during the earlier portion of the present century. At that date, the Black Douglases formed one of the most important divisions of the Jedhomes, or Gypsies, and the comparative purity of their descent is seen from the fact that they were even then generally dark complexion with black hair. They do not seem at so recent a period to have been popularly known as Black Douglases, though they were so, especially described, if specially described, sorry about that, it was probably as Tinkler or Gypsy Douglases. But in those swarthy Douglases of Jedhome, who, like others of their kind, were wild and daring marauders, at any astonishingly modern date, we have distinct representatives of the Black Douglas clans that, in far greater numbers and of far higher importance, terrorized the southern districts of Scotland 3 or 4 centuries before. Such Douglases, indeed, must be taken as the only proper representatives of that earlier race, for no other 19th century people bearing that surname existed under the same conditions. Douglases there were, and no doubt are, whose lineage might be traced back to the caste that sank below the surface in the 15th century. Such people may be descended from, let us say, Archibald the Grim, as truly as many living Virginians are descended from Pocahontas, though in a less degree, being more remote. But such Virginians are not typical Red Indians. It takes more than a few drops of certain blood to produce resemblance to the type from which it comes. With the Black Douglases of the debatable land around Jedhome in this present century, the case was different. Here were people inheriting not only an ancient name, but all the peculiarities attaching to it, having the same swarthy color, all right, the same archaic ideas, and living the same wild lives, or nearly so, as all their Black Douglas progenitors in Scottish history. These people were not merely an aggregation of individuals bearing the surname of Douglas, who might have been of all complexions and of the most different types and pedigrees. They were the latest remnant of a race nationality, distinguished from other men by the possession of certain racial characteristics shared by all of them alike as members of that nationality, holding themselves aloof from the farmers and farmer squires that intruded into their territory, resenting as long as they could the invasion and partition of what they rightly deemed their own country, and defying as long as they could the laws and usages of those who must be regarded as their conquerors. You know, just like the American Indians, right? Other men here and there may possess a partial claim to the blood of the Black Douglases, but that clan is not seen anywhere as a clan during the present century, except in the persons of the Gypsy Douglases of Jedhome. Leaving the consideration of particular tribes of Scots, let us regard those people from a greater distance. It was said on a previous page that under other conditions, the magic of Scott would have been nothing higher than that of the wandering gypsy. Such a hypothetical Scot would not, of course, have been Walter Scott at all, in lineage or in anything else, but that is what he would have been had he been by descent a pure moss trooping Scot. This is apparent not only because Scott moss trooper and gypsy are interchangeable terms and therefore equivalent to fuggler, but also from a description of the troopers under that name. And to convince me, says an old writer quoted by Scott, that they are not utter strangers to the black art of their forefathers, I met with a gentleman in the neighborhood who showed me a book of spells and magical receipts taken 2 or 3 days before in the pockets of one of our moss troopers, wherein among many other conjuring feats was prescribed a certain remedy for an ague by applying a few barbarous characters to the body of the party distemper. These methods were very near akin to Wormius Ram Runer, which he says differed wholly in figure and in shape from the common runa. It is unfortunately, too, probable that those barbarous characters have been lost forever, but it ought to be remembered that not only were the early Scots traditionally supposed to have come from Egypt, right? America to marry the beloved land, but they also made use of hieroglyphic writing. Okay, let's get all that highlighted. Boyle tells us in the New Maniers and Owls of Scottish that in all their secret business they use it not to write with common letterists, use it among other peoples, but uttered with ciphers and figures of beasties made in manner of letteris, sic as their epitatis and superscription above their sepulturis shew. Nonetheless, this crafty manner of writing, because left I cannot say is perished, and yet they have certain letteris proper among themselves, quilquis war some time vulgar and common. Thus the genuine Scot, so he's basically describing like a hieroglyphic kind of writing. Thus the genuine Scot of history stand connected with the Egyptians of antiquity, the ones of antiquity, okay? This is major drop here correlating with many of our videos, guys. I hope you guys are paying attention, see the connections, as well as with their modern British namesakes, and form the bridge, or one of the bridges that spans the immense chasms which divides the great Egypt, the great Tamari of history, from the much discredited Little Egypt of today, the fake one. Listen, even this author's telling you the great Egypt of history from the Little Egypt of today, the theme park of today, all right? It's not the same. Gosh, the hijack that were coming from America. Jugglery proper is one of those vocations that have, though not very long ago, passed away from the gypsies of the camps. It was pointed out some chapters back that just as the genuine prize fighter shows a hint of his pedigree in the gypsy side locks of his altogether invariably black straight hair, so the street mountebank suggested a like descent by his fantastic attire, his silver earrings, and the gay-colored handkerchief with which he confines his black and oily locks. All right, his locks. And the same professional lineage was also discerned in the grotesque party-colored dresses of the clowns of our circuses and theaters, as well as in their painted faces, shaven or bewigged heads, and in the semi-salam and the circus fraternity, where the clowns or mountebanks. All these things are originally the property of the Swarthy races, okay? All these things. All right, we got the previous chapters. Make sure to catch up on the series if you haven't. Check these out. In the medieval story of John of Rampain, the black minstrels were mountebanks or jugglers as well. Indeed, jongleur and juggler are only two different pronunciations of the same word, though in course of time a separate intonation gave a separate meaning, and the Gaelic dictionary, as we have seen, tell us that such feats of legerdemain are black tricks, just as magic is black art. Consequently, it was not wrong in any sense to apply the term juggler to the border moss troopers to whom books of spells and magical receipts peculiarly belong. It is probable, of course, that the fighting men did not profess jugglery themselves, leaving it to a particular division of their kinsmen. One distinct example of this profession is seen in a border Scot of the 17th century. He did not bear the name of Scot, being known as Reed the Mountebank. But since Reed is only a variation of Ruat, it is likely that the first of his line received that name in its sense of tawny, copper-colored, huh? Scott quotes the following regarding him from Lord Fountainhall's decisions. January 17th, 1687. Reed de Mountebank is received into the Popish Church, and one of his blackamoors was persuaded to accept of baptism from the Popish priest, and to turn the Christian Papist, which was a great trophy. He was called James, after the king and chancellor and the apostle James. That the borderers were jongleurs as well as jugglers is a fact that asserts itself without the faintest fear of opposition. It is a fact that can never be overlooked or forgotten until we have ceased to remember the existence of all the plaintive ballads and battle breathing lays that make up the minstrelsy of the Scottish border. But Scott himself has led us dreadfully astray. He was truly a magician, for the magic of his romances so charmed his readers that all of his antiquarian portraiture was accepted as true, whereas it was only partially true. This, of course, was recognized at the time by his fellow antiquaries, who were not slow to point out his errors. But of all those who have read his poems and romances, how many have read the contemporary criticisms? Thus his border moss trooper, Christie o' de Clinthill, may be accounted as lifelike, so far as his fierce and reckless nature is shown, in such accessories as the long lance, the rusty spurs and skull cap, and the generally dilapidated state of his accoutrements, are no doubt most exact representations, but instead of making this wild marauder speak better English than the mistress of Glenthurg, he ought to have put in his mouth the language of all Scottish mossers, from the time of Severus to that of Scott himself, the language of the Gypsies. And instead of making no reference whatever to his complexion, he ought to have emphasized his swarthy hue, all right? His swarthy hue. While in the battle scene where Christie is killed, it should have been specially stated that his face and the faces of all his dusky comrades were ruddled like that of Marshall the Galloway pig, or painted of various colors, according to the custom of the Foss from immemorial times up to the present century. As for his chief, Julian Avenel, his savage character, and such detail of his adherence to the polygamous and Picto-Scottish customs of hand-fasting, would entitle him to be classed among such inferior nobility as might have looked up to Black Lord Archibald of the old Douglas day. But from the lateness of his era and the comparative importance of his rank, his black hair may be admitted as the only evidence of his Egyptian descent. There would, however, have been no violation of facts had he been made as swarthy as any of his followers, all right? As swarthy as any of his followers. So again, with his last minstrel, just as the mother tongue of the Welsh harper is gypsy, just as the harp still emblematically remembered was the favorite instrument of the minstrels of ancient Scotia, whence the swarthy Scot Egyptian came, ancient Scotia, America. So ought this last of the border minstrels to have been emphatically a gypsy. On the contrary, he has nothing peculiarly gypsy about him, unless we accept the cheerful alacrity with which he drained the goblet crowned with mighty wine, so thoughtfully handed to him by the observant page. Scott is much nearer the mark in his more prosaic Wandering Willie of Red Gauntlet. He indeed is not styled a gypsy, but the description given of him is that of a gypsy, or more properly a gaberlunzie, or blue gown, which I take it is almost identical with gypsy. The silk handkerchief well knotted about his throat, the long, loose-bodied greatcoat or wrapped rascal secured around him by a large old-fashioned belt with brass studs, in which hung a dirk with a knife and fork. Its usual accompaniments are all distinctly characteristic of the last century gypsy. His consort, whose attire consisted of a plaid or plaid, a man's hat, a blue coat, which seemed also to have been an article of male apparel, and a red petticoat, and who wore a large amber necklace and silver earrings, and had her plaid fastened across her breast with a brooch of the same metal. It is as clearly a gypsy woman. The most exact description of a female gypsy in Mr. Simpson's book seems to be that of a Tweeddale Ronnie, Rani, or Queen, Mary Jorkston, by name, discounting a few fineries allowable in one of her exalted rank. Her picture closely resembles that of a wandering Willie's wife. She wore a large black beaver hat tied down over her ears with a handkerchief knotted below her chin in the gypsy fashion. Her upper garment was a dark blue short cloak, somewhat after the Spanish fashion. The greater part of her other apparel was made of dark blue camlet cloth, with petticoats so short that they scarcely reached the calves of her well-set legs. Her stockings were of dark blue worsted, flowered and ornamented at the ankles with scarlet thread, and in her shoes she displayed large, massy silver buckles. She was sometimes dressed in a green gown trimmed with red ribbons. Her outer petticoat was folded up round her haunches for a lap, with a large pocket dangling at each side, and below her cloak she carried between her shoulders a small flat pack or pad, which contained her most valuable articles. About her person she generally kept a large clasp knife, with a long broad blade resembling a dagger or carving knife, and carried in her hand a long pole or pike staff that reached about a foot above her head. I am particular in describing this Wandering Willie and his fellow wanderer because he is as real as Christopher Sly, which can scarcely be said of the slightly stagey minstrel of the lay. It is true that although a minstrel of the Scottish border, he was not a harper but a simple fiddler. But this objection is a very trifling one. What I wish to point out is the great probability that all the jongleurs of the borders, to go no farther at present, from whom we have derived those pathetic and impassioned ballads, belong to that intensely musical people whom we vaguely know as gypsies. A glance at border story, as recounted by a borderer, quite strengthens this belief. For example, a traditional tale of a wedding in the family of Polwarth during the 15th century states that the music to which the marriage party danced proceeded from the pipes of King Johnny Fa, who with a half dozen of his people sat each with a pair of union pipes beneath his arm. Another tale of the border speaks of Jamie Allen, the gypsy and Northumberland piper, and of odd Piper Allen James Father, an instance of hereditary bardship, while an imaginary episode in the life of James V of Scotland, founded on his well-known bohemian habits, makes him assume the character of Wat Wilson, the king of the beggars, or Gaberlunzies, with his pipes and his wallets, in which disguise he sets a company of rustic revellers, dancing to such airs as Gilcoo Hisker, Brum on Tool, Torti Soli Lemendo, and other good old tunes now forgotten. The names of which airs, by the way, suggest like the Sheltatati or Tinkler speech, a union between Gaelic and Gypsy, or Pictish. Moreover, Simpson, at page 226 of his History of the Gypsies, informs us that many practiced music, and the violin and bagpipes were the instruments they commonly used. This musical talent of the Gypsies delighted the country people, and contributed much to procure the wanderers a night's quarters. Many of the families of the farmers looked forward to the expected visits of the merry gypsies with pleasure and regretted their departure, and Layden points to the same characteristics when he says, On Jeta's banks, the vagrant gypsies place their turf-built cots, a sunburned swarthy race, all right, a swarthy race. But in the lonely barn from towns remote, the piping bladder opes its creaking throat to aid the rebels of the noisy rout, whom wanton dance or push the cups about. All right. So, like eventually they were known to be entertainers, right? They had a lot of talent. They did entertain a lot of the wealthier people as they traveled. That's how they made a lot of their living a lot of the time. But look how they're describing them as swarthy, a swarthy race, of which picture Wordsworth has made a companion sketch. For when his female vagrant joined a band of wild house-less wanderers, who with their panniers a set semblance made of potters wandering on from door to door, one of the allurements of the gypsy life held out her was the bagpipe dining on the midnight moor, and barn uplighted in a companion's boon well met from far. The favorite airs played at such gatherings, there can be little doubt were those good old tunes now forgotten, which Wilson refers to, and the songs that those wandering minstrels were never tired of singing were, says Mr. Simpson, those that recorded the exploits of the border thieves, how Hobby Noble helped to rescue Jock O'Deside from Newcastle jail and was himself hanged at Carlisle for that and other misdeeds, how Hughie the Grim stole the Bishop of Carlisle's mare and was afterwards hanged for it, or how Archia of Cuffield's kinsman rode into Dumfries one dark night, broke into the jail where he was confined, and carried him off with them in triumph, a feat which Jock Johnston's scribe intended to emulate in the beginning of last century, and at Dumfries also had not the vigilance of the policeman more than a match for them. These were some of the favorite melodies of those border gypsies, and Scots had preserved them in his minstrelsy. All right, so very interesting. Earlier we are reading about, the history of why they became thieves and all that Douglas says, and they got this franchise, they lost everything, and then you know, and now their stories and what they lived later on in generations, they become songs, part of the tradition and the culture they used to sing, right? But the oldest and most interesting of all their repertory must now be hopelessly lost, because these, says Mr. Simpson, were in their own language. You guys hear that? And as everything appearing to them and to their language has been almost effaced by the legislation of the last 4 centuries, there can be very little of the genuine minstrelsy of the Scottish border surviving at the present day. Therefore, whether the bards of Wales, whose mother tongue is Gypsy, are descendants of those Egyptian Scots from America that overran that territory in the 4th century, and who used such coracles as those still used there, whether the Welsh bards have this particular ancestry or not, the bards of the Scottish border, wherever we see them distinctly, are gypsies. They may in this or that instance show more of the characteristics of one particular sect or division of this race, one being more particularly a gaberlunzi or sturdy rogue, another a beggar, another a thief or a bard or a moser, a jongleur or a juggler, but they are all united by racial ties. The laws of the Norman Stuarts, all right, the Norman Stuarts, remember, they came later, they're not indigenous to Scotland, directed against this ultra Scottish section of the Scots, revealed this circumstance as clearly as the links of dress and custom which unite the several varieties of this wandering people. In the reign of James II, alluded to, we find a way put in of sorners, forcible obtruders, fancied fools, vagabonds, outliers, masterful beggars, birds, strolling rhymers, and such like runners about, is more than once enforced by act of Parliament. And again it is enacted that such as make themselves fools and are birds, or others such as like runners about, being apprehended, their ears shall be nailed to the trunk or other tree, and cut off, and themselves banished the country. And if thereafter they be found again, they shall be executed. And again, other statutes are made for the better trial of common sorners, vagabonds, and masterful beggars, fancied fools, and counterfeit Egyptians, to the effect that they may still preserve till they be compelled to settle at some certain dwelling or be expelled forth of the country. Others are ordained so that strong beggars, vagabonds, and Egyptians should be punished, and through the non enforcement of such statutes, it is stated in a later act that strong and idle beggars, being for the most part thieves, bears, and counterfeit lemurs, living most insolently and ungodly without marriage or baptism, are suffered to vague and wander throughout the whole country. And in the more imperative ordinance of 1603, the Privy Council were induced to venture on the more effectual expedient at, of at once ordering the whole race to leave the kingdom by a certain day and never to return under the pain of death, just like the Inquisition, right? And this last statute, it is plainly intimated that the common bond uniting those diverse characters was one of a race, the race of the Grimes, or Swarthy people, Swarthy people they're getting rid of. And as the border traditions just quoted show the Gaberlunzi or blue gown to be a piper and a king of the beggars, and at the same time show that piper is really a synonym for gypsy, so those acts relating to that race regard as one the jongleur, the juggler or clown, and the thief or sturdy beggar. The changes on these names might be run endlessly, or at any rate for a greater length of time that can be spared here. For the fancied fool or counterfeit Egyptian was a counterfeit limmer, by reason of his being an Egyptian, a fa, and a pig. So recently as last century, we have seen that it was said them that to color their impostures they artificially discolored their faces, and without accepting the correctness of the motive assigned to them, it was evident to us that this custom constituted them fas or pigs, so that the counterfeit lemur was a counterfeit limner. Whether these words are identical or not, it is difficult to decide whether the word counterfeit was used with reference to their jugglery or to their custom of artificially discoloring their faces, but in either acceptation it is very suitably applied. What, however, is more to the point at present is that the bards, or form of the Gaelic bard, are everywhere identified with the Egyptians, all right, with the Temerians from America, whether the instrument upon which they play is the harp, the violin, or the bagpipes. Therefore, the representative border minstrel or jongleur ought to have been clearly depicted as the kinsman of jugglers such as Reed the Mountebank and his blackamoors. All right, his blackamoors. It is not too much to say that if the author of Waverley had never lived, the border gypsies would always have been popularly regarded as the unconverted descendants of the earlier border moss troopers, and Mr. Simpson would not have required to explain that the gypsies in general appeared to have located themselves upon grounds of a flattish character between the cultivated and uncultivated districts, having on one side a fertile and populous country, and on the other a healthy, boggy, and barren waste, into which they could retire in times of danger. Because Fuller had long ago stated that such people were called moss troopers, because dwelling in the mosses and riding in the troops together. Indeed, the following sentences, published while yet The Lay of the Last Minstrel was only 3 years old, the Waverley novels unwritten, and before society in general had accustomed itself to look at border history through the spectacles of Sir Walter Scott. These sentences show quite plainly that the identity of border moss trooper and border gypsy was then regarded as a simple fact. Great Britain is now perhaps more free from banditti than any of her neighbors, but formerly she was as much harassed as most of the nations on the continent. Among these border banditti stood eminently forward the marches between England and Scotland, or the borders as they were called, were particularly favorable for the existence of these vermin. The debatable lands, a tract of country situated between the Esk and the Sarkey, was so called because it was claimed by both countries, or more properly, by the borderers of the south and of the north, and the inhabitants were inclined to consider themselves as belonging to neither, and to obey neither, though very much disposed to plunder from both. The English borderers were therefore ever ready to make a foray, so they called plundering excursions into Scotland, and the Scottish borderers, on the other hand, were as ready to return a raid as they called a plundering incursion into England for the foray. Some rich and noble families on the borders are said to owe the origin of their wealth and nobility to this species of robbery, and the mottos of some of the border families to this day attest the fact. These borderers seem to have considered all this as honorable, or at least not disgraceful. The following distinction of the poet Scott of Satchel uh, seems to us now a distinction without a difference. It's most clear a freebooter doth live in the hussard's train. A freebooter's a cavalier that ventures life for gain. But since King James the Sixth to England went, there has been no cause of grief, and he has hath transgressed since then, is no freebooter but a thief. And Mr. Simpson has told us that when Johnston, the gypsy chief, was to be hanged at Dumfries, it was rumored that the thieves of Annandale were mustering to the rescue. The following charges, though the loss on each side will no doubt be rather exaggerated than diminished by the complainants, will give us some idea of the depredations committed by the borderers in their raids and forays, even so late as Queen Elizabeth's reign. Then, after giving various particulars regarding those earlier borderers, the writer adds, on the borders there still exist some remains of these banditti. They travel the country in the character of tinkers, honors, foreigners, or spoonmakers, and occasionally steal sheep and plunder houses. One Tom Gordon, who was condemned to be hanged for sheep stealing about 15 years ago, was a noted ringleader of them. This last paragraph, which of course is not in italicized, the original, which is not italicized in the original, bring down the border moss troopers into the 19th century. It expressed the unquestioned opinion of a man who belonged to a generation as yet uninfluenced by the genius of Walter Scott, and it also expressed what will become the opinion of all who take the trouble to examine the characteristics of the border moss troopers, and who are thereby made to realize that Scott, however admirable in other respects, was anything but an infallible exponent of border history. It will be remembered that Lord Fountainhall, with a needless display of the narrow intolerance that characterized a certain division of his contemporaries, refers to the baptism of one of Reed's, the Mountebank's blackamoors, by a Christian priest, and one of the statutes cited above describes such blackamoors as living most insolently and ungodly without marriage or baptism, while another writer of that period, to whom we turn for information, Dr. Fuller, was also said, speaking of those moss troopers, they come to church as seldom as the 29th of February comes into the calendar. From all of which it is apparent that this irreconcilable remnant of the early Scots and Picts had never accepted, even in form, the Christian religion, as the greater part of their kindred had done now. Their nearest approach to marriage was the concubinage and polygamy openly practiced within the last century by such gypsy thieves as the Fifeshire Drummond and Marshall of Galloway. Openly practiced in the 16th century, according to Scott, by such of them as Julian Avenel represents, and openly practiced with even slighter lines of demarcation by certain tribes of early Picts and Scots, described by such classical writers as Solinus and Strabo. That such men should never attend a Christian church is therefore not astonishing, for in fact Christianity was to them a wholly alien creed. Their religion was represented by the books of spells and magical receipts, you know, dodge the hijack, that they carried about with them, whose hieroglyphic characters may connect them with Egypt itself. Paleo Hebrew? What are they talking about here? Or else with the shamanism of ancient Persia, which Pliny thought so closely resembled the mystic religion of Druidism. To say that they lived without marriage or baptism was incorrect. They lived according to their own laws, religious and social, though these laws were vastly different from those favored by Christianity, to whose followers such practices were only a part of the black art of the Gypsies' forefathers. Not being Christians themselves, they did not feel bound in any way to obey the laws of Christianity, but they had their own religious ceremonies nevertheless. What these were may be learned from several learned writers upon the Gypsies and others who have described the customs of various races of anti-Norman Britons, and they may also be traced in many observances not yet extinct among ourselves. It is of great importance to bear in mind this religious phase of the question. One can never hope to understand, however slightly, the movements of past centuries unless one sees that they were the struggles between wholly antagonistic sets of ideas, as well as between wholly different races of men. All those laws of the Stuarts, framed against Egyptian thieves and jugglers, all right, Egyptians, so called Egyptians, right, coming from America, aimed at the complete stamping of out of certain modes of life and ways of thought that were utterly opposed to the ideas brought in at the Norman conquest and existent, though not paramount before that date. What those laws in effect said was this: become civilized according to our ideas, the ideas of the lawmakers, profess our religion, and live as we do. Refuse to do this, and we will, being stronger, will expatriate you, will enslave you, will kill you at sight. Your women shall be burned as witches, and the unreclaimed portion of your race shall be outlawed everywhere. All right? That sounds just like the Inquisition. Who are they really going after, huh? So called Hebrews, Muslims? The question as to whether one race of men has the right to treat another as nation of criminals simply because the latter refuses to accept the laws and ideas of the former is subsidiary to the present theme. But this, the radical belief of most modern Europeans and their offshoots, although not plainly formulated by them, was held as a matter above dispute by our predecessors of the 17th century. We learned this from the statement made by Dr. Fuller and his description of the border Mosers of that period, or Mosers. After that they are outlawed, he says, quoting the deliverance of a celebrated lawyer, they lawfully may be destroyed, without any judicial inquisition, as who carry their own condemnation about them, and deservedly die without law, because they refuse to live according to the law. But for what were they outlawed? Not for taking away of life, or not by any means invariably so, but for practicing the black art of their forefathers, right? A so-called black art, for being sorcerers, right? They said that about the shamans and Indians, right? When they were healing people with natural herbs, and magicians and polygamists, for being such as make themselves fools and are bears, or others such like runners about. In other words, for following the non-Christian idle and vagabond habits of their ancestors. For doing this, they were punished, and if they would not see the error of their ways, they were executed. The principle thus laid down by the conquering race was very simple. It was this: when one race refuses to live according to law, as law is understood by another, the other is quite justified in treating members of the first race as escaped criminals, it being always understood that the race of amateur judges is vastly more powerful than that of the assumed lawbreakers. The argument is plausible, and the action it inculcates makes a ready way out of a troublesome question, but its morality is a little dubious. Perhaps the fairest way to regard the question is this: those Mosers, marsh dwellers, Egyptians, minstrels, jugglers, fancied fools, and what not, were the lineal descendants of various piratical nations that at one time or another had molested the peace-loving sections of the population of early Britain. They had overrun the whole country at various epochs and under various historical names. Those divisions of them that we have more particularly regarded, the Scots, Picts proper, and Black Danes, that devastated the northern portion of the main island, had apparently been the sovereigns of that territory during many of the earlier centuries of the Christian era. No exact date can be fixed upon as the time of their overthrow, but we know that by the 10th century, the black divisions of Scotland had dwindled down to three, and that by the 12th century, the Moors or Morays had been broken up into detached clans. By the end of the 15th century, one of the most powerful and perhaps the latest of such black confederacies, okay, had been hurled from all political positions down to the level of persecuting and persecuted banditti, diminishing in numbers and importance with each successive generation. It is immaterial whether the successful race ought to be called Romanized Celtic or Anglo Norman or Dutch. It is enough that these races resemble each other in ideas as they probably did in feature. So either like the invaders, right? The invaders to the local Scottish indigenous Picts, Scots and Moors, as they were calling them. It is enough that these races resembled each other, he's saying, in features too. They believed in Christianity and the results that flow from its practice, while the ways of the savage Scythians were always abhorrent to them, from the time of Gildas onward, if not from an earlier date. Therefore, since warfare against them was legitimate in the days of their ascendancy and of their later rivalry, it did not at once cease to be lawful after their power was broken. Not any rate, not at any rate, so long as they retained those fierce and hateful qualities that made them originally regarded with aversion by the nobler living races by whom they were conquered, that large numbers of them became gradually converted and incorporated into the main body of the composite British nation, bringing with them an added vigor and certain new attributes as stated by Sir Walter Scott in the passages just quoted. Is stated also by the historian of the Scottish Gypsies and is confirmed by the pedigree which an eminent living ethnologist assigns to the mixed type which he styles Melanochroi, which type being that of an alleged majority of the present British people, argues a very important minority of swarthy ancestors. These gradually falling in with the ideas prevalent since the Norman conquest and steadily gaining ground for many centuries before, became members of the civilized British nation, and in their turn became the opponents of their own distant kinsfolk, the irreconcilable section of the Scythian races, Saxon, sons of Isaac, those irreconcilables, the bigoted Tories of their race maintained, as long as they were permitted to do so, the fiercest and most objectionable characteristics of their ancestry, and refused most absolutely to conform to the laws and customs that were now those of the nation. Had they been left to themselves, they would have retarded the progress of peace and culture by 1,000 years. Consequently, the severe and imperious measures taken by the Stuart kings formed the only practical solution of the difficulty. For the sake of the rest of the community, it was imperative that these savages should cease to be savage or cease to be. Besides, it is apparent, or it will be increasingly apparent, the more the matter is investigated, that those proscribed vagabonds were mostly of an extremely low type of humanity. This is seen in one instance by looking at those gypsies that were enslaved in the reign of James VI and sent down to work in the coal pits of the Lothians, right? And also to the plantations of America. Remember who colonized Jamestown? James? They and theirs were absolute slaves. And it is one of the strangest facts in history that they remained so in a nominally free country until the latter part of the last century. The appearance of the descendants of those vagabonds and sturdy beggars of the 16th century is described by Hugh Miller from the evidence of his own eyesight, not 60 years since. The collier women of this village poor, overtoiled creatures who carried up all the coal from underground on their backs by a long turnpike stair inserted in one of the shafts, continued to bear more of the marks of serfdom still about them, even the men, than even the men, sorry. How these poor women did labor, and how thoroughly, even at this time, were they characterized by the slave nature. They were marked by a peculiar type of mouth, by which I learned to distinguish them from all the other females of the country. It was wide open, thick-lipped, all right, thick-lipped, projecting equally above and below, and exactly resembled that which we find in the prints given of savages in their lowest and most degraded state in such narratives of our modern voyagers as, for instance, the narrative of Captain Fitzroy's second voyage of the Beagle, all right, when they went to South America. Real quick, this is kind of what they're talking about. This is the actual voyages of the Adventure in the Beagle. This was done by Charles Darwin. He went to South America before he wrote his book, of evolution. He met the Fuegians. Look at this image, what they're saying, they're drawing them with the thick lips. These are what they described as Negro people, Swarthy Indians, the Fuegians in South America. Fuegian, this is how you spell it. All right, just wanted to show you guys that. So again, the gypsy women being described, again, with very thick lips projecting equally above and below, just like the ones they drew of the Fuegians, in this narrative here in this book. It was accompanied by traits of almost infantile weakness. I have seen these coolier women crying like children when toiling under their load along the upper round of the wooden stair that traversed the shaft, and then returning scarcely a minute after with the empty creel, singing with glee. This then was the mouth of the 16th century vagabond, the identical mouth that heraldry has registered as the mouth of the British Moor, all right? So-called black features, right? What they're trying to say, the very wide mouth and thick lips of the mulatto-hued Gitanos or Gitano gypsies, Gitanos of the Pyrenees, the bubbler lips of the naked Siwatok of the Hebridean caves, and the very mouth that, by a happy chance, our circus clowns have presented to us as that of the fancied fools of the past. You see, they were always making fun or trying to depict so-called black folks or black people. All right, is what he's trying to tell you. And not only have these last preserved to us a semblance of the features, a probably exact picture of the style of painting, the face, of dressing the hair, and of wearing the clothes, characterizing those former fancied fools, once the clowns of the country, but they have also retained for us an exact representation of their brain power, which was almost nil, so that both the actual posterity of those counterfeit Egyptians and the guise in which one branch of their professional descendants appear before us today agree in representing the painted Moors of the 16th century, or rather, one division of them, and that the lowest in all probability, as alike hideous in aspects and feeble in intellect. Add to this that one quality inseparable from the buffon of other days is typified by the just obscene, referred to by Garth as quoted by Dr. Johnson, and it will be seen that had the civilized portion of the Scotch people during the 16th century accorded to such a race the full rights and liberties of the lieges, they would have been something more than quixotic. Those vagabonds and fancied fools may indeed have had the excuse that their ways and their religion, such as it was, were their inheritance. But these ways and that religion were so foul and degraded that toleration would have been pushed to the extreme of foolishness, and the dominant power acted otherwise than it did. Therefore, all those acts against Egyptians, witches, sorcerers, and such like were in reality so many manifestations of that world-old tendency, whose operation we call evolution, the working of which is manifested at the present day every time a criminal is executed or a lunatic sequestered. It is somewhat premature, however, to moralize upon the rights and wrongs of the action taken by the civilized Scotch, using that word in its widest sense, 2 or 3 centuries ago, and previously in dealing with the dregs of certain races that once existed in these islands. We have been trying to ascertain the chief characteristics of this vagabond refuse, and what we seem to have discovered is that the nearest living representatives of that class are the people whom we know as gypsies, or we know as gypsies, that if the modern gypsies are, as they often are, handsome in body and mind, it is because they have mingled with other and higher races and have also imbibed higher ideas than those held by the purely Egyptian branch of their ancestry. From America to marry ancient Egypt, to marry their branch, that branch of their ancestry. Oh, we about to get deep. Who are everywhere, seen to have been black and hideous. Gosh, the hijack. You see, that's how they were drawing them, trying to come and mock them, right? Outwardly and inwardly, anything but fair and lovely. We have also seen that the robber tribes, whose nickname has become affixed to the country and people of Scotland, were Egyptians by tradition, all right? By tradition, from America to marry, by use of hieroglyphics, by complexion, and perhaps by other characteristics. This was seen both by regarding them as so many black herds of 4th century pirates and by looking at them in separate clans of black Douglases, Scots, and other moss troopers. In all these instances, we discern the lineaments and customs of the greatly mixed people known as gypsies. But since the district selected for examination was limited to the southern portion of Scotland, it is necessary that we should glance at other parts of that country to see if the same identification can be made elsewhere than in the south. All right, and that is the end of the chapter, guys. All right. So yeah, that was a pretty interesting chapter, guys. That was a long read today. We read about 63, 64 pages. All right. Yeah, I read, but I enjoyed it. It's a good reading. You know, I enjoyed reading this a lot. Again, this was the book Ancient and Modern Britons, Volume 1 by David MacRitchie. There's another chapter we're going to definitely get into in this volume before we head over to Volume 2. We got a lot more drop coming from this author. I hope you guys enjoyed this reading. I think it's very important to know this history here in this region of the world because it does link to ancient America eventually, you guys will see. And also to know that all these people, a lot of these people were melanated folks, right? And they weren't from Africa. And by the term Moor, they don't just mean North African Muslim from the Maghreb, Al-Maghreb, Morocco areas. No, that's not what they mean in every case. They're just talking about swarthy people, dark complexion people, indigenous to these parts of the world. We're talking about the British Isles. Thanks for taking the time to hear me read this long chapter. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to do that, especially if you did it during the live here. Appreciate everybody that came through. Shout out to all my Patreon supporters, all the moderators, all the longtime followers, supporters, all my new members of my channel. Make sure to join the channel if you can. All right, if you like to support that way, a couple little perks here and there for you, and I will be improving those as I go. But yeah, thanks for again tuning in, guys. All the blessings you give me, all the support, appreciate it very much. We're gonna continue reading more books. All right, we're gonna get more and more in depth into this real history. Shout out to all the new subscribers. Welcome to the channel. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Hawa.